Hello, young soul. I was tired. Tired of the city, the people, the incessant noise. So, when I found that ad, I didn't think twice. A simple house in a remote village in the countryside. The price was low, so low it felt like a gift. The description read, "Unique opportunity for those seeking tranquility." And that was exactly what I was looking for. I never thought much about why anyone would move to such an isolated place. But that house felt like a shelter, a refuge for my weary spirit. It was an old house, with dark wooden walls and windows too big for the size of the place. I could see the treetops outside, swaying slowly in the wind. The place had a peculiar smell, a mix of mold and damp breath. But it was cozy in a way. Or at least that's what I thought in the first few days. In the first days, the house felt normal. There was nothing particularly frightening. But as night fell, something began to form, like an invisible mist. Something that couldn't be touched, but seemed to creep into my mind. I didn't know it then, but the house was already starting to shape me. The first nights were calm, but something began to change when the clock struck midnight. I started dreaming. But these weren't just dreams. They were experiences. I was in other places, in other lives. A country house with a crackling fireplace. A dark river running through a dense forest. An old woman walking in the shadows, with empty eyes. It was as if my mind was being pulled into another reality, something I couldn't comprehend. I would wake up sweating, heart racing, feeling an unbearable pressure on my forehead, as if something was trying to squeeze out from within me. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember what was happening, only a sense of distortion. As if I were floating between two realities, and neither of them was safe. It was in those first days that I heard the voices. They weren't clear, like a conversation, but a kind of low murmur, a muffled whisper, as if the walls were trying to tell me something. I tried to ignore them, thinking it was fatigue. After all, it was a fresh start. I was trying to get used to the new routine. But the thoughts began to change. I, who always had control over my mind, started to lose that grip. Sometimes I would be doing something completely ordinary, like preparing dinner, and suddenly my mind would slip away, as if a ghost had touched it. Images would start flooding my field of vision: a crying child, a woman with a disfigured face, a shadowy figure watching from a window. No, it's not real. It's not real, I repeated, trying to hold on to rationality. But the voices, those same whispering voices, began to become clearer. And then, in the middle of one of those episodes, I realized they were not mine. At first, I tried to rationalize, convincing myself that it was just the stress of the move, or perhaps something related to isolation. But increasingly, the discomfort grew, and with it, the feeling that I was no longer alone. It happened on a particularly stuffy morning. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, when suddenly the pressure in my forehead intensified. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the malaise, when a vivid image appeared in my mind. A woman. She stood before me, her face twisted in a look of terror, her eyes completely white. She reached out her hands towards me, as if calling me. I jerked my eyes open and saw myself in the mirror. But something was wrong. The reflection was not mine. It was that woman's reflection. She was grinning in a macabre way, her teeth sharp and disordered. I screamed and stumbled back, but when I looked at the mirror again, she had vanished. I stood there for minutes, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The mirror now seemed deeper, as if something had expanded behind it, a vast darkness. The feeling that I was not alone intensified with every passing hour, as if the house was waiting for something. But the worst was yet to come. I knew that. When silence took over the house, I knew it was not normal. It was dense, oppressive. As if the house were watching me, waiting for the right moment to manifest. I could no longer trust my own thoughts. And as night fell again, I felt the house closing in around me, like a trap that had already ensnared me without my notice. I had moved to that place seeking tranquility. Now, the house was beginning to devour my mind. I was starting to lose track of time. Days went by and the house seemed to shape my perception of reality more and more. It was no longer just an old house with dark walls and creaking wooden floors. No, It was alive. I didn't know how, but I knew it was watching every move I made, analyzing every thought, feeling every emotion I tried to hide. It was one night, after a stuffy afternoon lost in my own thoughts, that something truly strange happened. I lay down on the bed, exhausted. The heat of the house seemed to rise, the air becoming dense, as if it were compressing around me. When I fell asleep, I didn't dream as before. No. What happened was much worse. I felt the house. I felt the walls pulsing. They were not solid, but something fluid, something that moved with the same cadence as my heart. Each beat, each breath, seemed to echo in every corner of the house. I was motionless, powerless to move, as if something invisible had paralyzed me. It was not a nightmare. It was real. The house was inside me. The pressure in my forehead returned, but this time it was stronger, more painful. It felt as if something was trying to escape from inside me, a strange presence dragging itself out, like a cold draft slithering under the door. I began to hear the murmur of voices again, but now they were no longer whispering softly. They were screaming. Not words, not phrases, just incessant cries, as if all the souls the house had ever consumed were pleading for help. Or worse, pleading for company. And then, something else happened. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow steps coming from the hallway. But there was no one there. The house was empty. There was no one else but me. The footsteps continued, however, getting closer, dragging along, as if someone was crawling. I felt trapped. I couldn't move my legs, I couldn't scream. All I could do was wait. Wait for the thing approaching to be real, or wait for it all to be an illusion. But it wasn't an illusion. The door to my room creaked open with a sharp sound, so loud it made me jump out of bed. I looked into the darkness of the hallway, and then something moved in the shadows. It wasn't a person, but a shape, formless yet embodying something human. It was crawling into my room, its movements slow, hesitant, as if adapting to the environment, as if trying to mold itself to the darkness around it. Its eyes, or what seemed to be its eyes, glowed for a moment with a dull, sickly light, and I felt terror seep into my bones, into my soul. I tried to get up, but my body did not respond. I knew I was awake. I knew I was alive. But in that moment, something inside me also knew I was no longer in control. The house had claimed another piece of me. I began to hear its words. Not words in the usual sense, but something like a whisper within my own mind. They weren't my thoughts, yet they felt familiar. It was as if I had heard those words before, as if I had spoken them at some other time, in some other life. The voice said, "You won't be leaving anymore. You will never leave." Panic took hold of me, but there was nothing more I could do. The whispers wouldn't stop, they wouldn't cease, and I could no longer distinguish between my own thoughts and those of the house. It was invading me, molding me, controlling my mind, and I no longer had the strength to fight it. The next day, when I woke up, the house was quieter than ever. But something was different. The air felt denser, heavier. The sensation of being watched was stronger, as if something was following me with every step I took. And it was that day that I realized something horrifying. I no longer thought the way I used to. My reactions were different. My choices became erratic. As if someone was manipulating my thoughts, gradually distorting them. I began to observe myself with suspicion, with fear. Sometimes, I would catch myself looking in the mirror, trying to perceive if I was still me, if the eyes staring back were my own. They seemed empty, as if consumed by something. Something I couldn't see, but felt, something that was taking over my soul, piece by piece. And it was then that I started to realize that the house already knew who I was. It knew my deepest secrets, my darkest fears, everything I tried to hide from myself. Every thought of mine was manipulated. Every feeling, every emotion, everything was being recorded. I could no longer distinguish between my own thoughts and those the house planted in my mind. I grew weaker, more isolated. More and more I found myself doing things I didn't understand. Something was pushing me towards the abyss. And when I looked out the windows, I saw something outside. It wasn't a person, but a presence, a shape moving in the shadows, watching me from afar. I didn't know what was real and what was created by the house. Everything seemed distorted. as if I were sinking deeper into darkness, under the absolute control of that entity. I was afraid to sleep, but I knew it didn't matter. I no longer had control over my own thoughts, and I knew the house wouldn't let me go. It had caught me. It had devoured my mind. And as the nights passed, more and more, I felt like I was fading away, that my soul was becoming part of that house. I had been deceived. The price I paid for that new beginning, for that refuge, had been much higher than I could have imagined. I was no longer the same. I was part of it now, and I knew I would never leave. Time, or what I thought was time, began to distort. The sun seemed to no longer set in the same way. When the day came to an end, the horizon was trapped in a thick fog, a faint light unable to dispel the total darkness that engulfed the house. And I didn't know what to do anymore. I tried to leave. Not once nor twice. There were countless attempts. But the house wouldn't let me go. It knew how to trap my mind, how to capture my spirit, and with each passing moment, my resistance melted away. I was increasingly exhausted, with no strength to fight. One morning, or perhaps it was late at night, I could no longer tell the hours. I went to the hallway, with unsteady steps and a constant feeling of vertigo. I was no longer sure if I was dreaming or awake. The house seemed to expand around me, as if it were swallowing reality, each fragment of meaning slowly dissolving. The walls, once made of wood, now seemed liquids, as if a viscous substance was seeping through them. I placed my hand on the wall, and it deformed under my touch, cold and sticky, like rotting flesh. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but instead of backing away, something inside me urged me to move forward. I was being drawn into the very house itself. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. I had ignored it until then, but at that moment, I couldn't resist. Something within me, or perhaps the house itself, compelled me to open it. The room was empty. Almost. As I entered, I noticed the air was denser, warmer, and a nauseating odor lingered in the atmosphere. Something was rotten. Something was decaying within the house, and I began to realize that it wasn't just its structure that was decomposing, but also me. I was falling apart inside. I approached the broken window. Outside, the field was shrouded in a heavy fog. It wasn't an ordinary fog. It was thick, dark, as if it were alive, as if it were watching. And then, I realized what was missing: the sound. The absolute silence. The wind did not blow. No animal sang. There was no life. Just that opaque mist and the sense that something else was there, lurking. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the window, it was no longer my face I saw. It was the woman. The same woman from the mirror, with white eyes and a distorted mouth, grinning at me in a macabre way. But now, it was not just a reflection. She was there, beside me. And I knew it wasn't a trick of the mind. She was truly there. The pressure on my forehead returned, much more intense than before. I couldn't breathe. The sensation of being invaded became unbearable. The house was feeding on me, devouring my sanity, my soul. The voices that once were whispers were now screams, distorted, overlapping one another, invading my thoughts uncontrollably. The woman slowly turned her head toward me. Her hand stretched out, the thin, pale fingers seemed to want to touch me, but I couldn't move. I didn't want to. She didn't speak, but I could feel what she wanted to say. The house was taking me. I was a part of it now, and it possessed me completely. At that moment, I was seized by a vision. I don't know if it was a delusion, a nightmare, or if it really happened, but it was vivid. I saw the dark hallways of the house, and in each of them, a figure. People. But they were not alive. They were just existing. Their eyes were empty, and their bodies were partially decomposed, as if time had stopped for them. They were trapped there, just like me. One of the figures slowly approached. It was a man, or what was left of him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were completely cloudy. He no longer seemed human. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. He came close to me and, soundlessly, pointed to the door. I understood, even without words. The house wanted me to be just another one. It wanted me to be the next. It wouldn't let me leave. The house needed me. I was just another victim. That's when I learned the truth. Every person who had lived there before me, every soul that had been lost within those walls, was trapped, like an echo, a fragment of their existence. The house devoured them, and their thoughts, their emotions, were swallowed, becoming part of it. The house was not just a structure. It was an entity, an ancient thing, feeding on the mind, the emotions, the soul. I found myself back in my bed. I don't remember returning there. I lay still. I felt as though I was being watched, as if the house was analyzing me, waiting for my surrender. But a part of me was still fighting. I didn't know how, but I didn't want to be just another shadow of that house. I didn't want to be consumed. However, when I looked in the mirror, I saw something that made me realize I no longer had control. I was no longer me. I was no longer a person. I was a part of the house, a piece within that infernal machine. The woman in the mirror was there again, smiling, and her eyes were mine. I no longer had my own thoughts. Only the house thought for me. And as silence took over, I knew there would never be an escape. I was the house, and the house was me. The house was no longer just a place. It was a state of being, an endless nightmare that extended beyond the walls and the roofs. It reached inside me, consuming every fragment of my existence. I felt my essence unraveling, my being fading, and no matter how hard I tried to resist, there was nothing more I could do. I was no longer who I used to be. I had no name, no identity. I was her. The house. I lay in bed, but my mind was far away, trapped in a whirlwind of images and sounds. The voices echoed within me, merging with my own thoughts, and I no longer knew which were mine and which belonged to the house. It was as if something was pulling me down into a mental abyss, where there was no light, no shadow, only an absolute void. And I sank deeper with each passing second. But that night, something different happened. The silence. The absolute silence. Nothing moved within me anymore. Nothing felt real. The house made no more noise, the voices were quiet, as if all the souls it had devoured were finally at peace. But I knew it wasn't peace. It was a pause. Something was about to happen. I got up from the bed with automatic movements, as if guided by an invisible force. The hallway was dark, darker than ever, and the air was heavy, dense. Each step I took seemed to echo, reverberating against the rotten wooden walls, and as I walked, a low sound began to fill the void, a whisper, very distant, but growing. It was the house. She was speaking. I knew what she wanted. She wanted to consume me once and for all. She wanted me to be a permanent part of her. And, as I had already experienced, being a part of her meant there would be no turning back. There would be no more me. The house would feed on everything I am, until I disappeared completely. I reached the door that was closed. It had never been opened before, but something inside me, or perhaps inside the house, told me I needed to enter. The door was cold to the touch, and I hesitated for a moment. But the feeling of increasing pressure on my forehead pushed me forward. I had no choice. As I opened the door, an involuntary scream escaped my lips. What I saw before me was impossible. It was an empty room, but at the same time, it was full of eyes. Thousands of them. Human eyes, but distorted, twisted, looking at me, watching my every move. I couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't breathe. It was as if I were being observed by all the people who had lived in that house. All the souls the house had consumed were there, trapped, and their minds, their consciousnesses, were screaming for freedom. But I knew there would be no freedom. I entered the room, and as I did, a wave of pain spread throughout my body. My heart raced, and I fell to my knees on the floor. The pressure on my forehead intensified, and a sensation of absolute darkness overtook me. I saw shadows moving around me, as if they were feeding on my pain, on my fear. And then a sound, a low, guttural voice from the depths of the house, whispered once more, "Now you are part of us." I could no longer control my body. The shadows, the presences, began to move inside me, as if they were fitting in, merging into my flesh, into my mind. Every fragment of me was being whipped away and replaced, until I was no longer me. I was no longer a person. I was an idea, an echo of the house. I no longer had an identity. I was lost. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. I was trapped in this. Trapped inside the house, and worse yet, trapped within myself, in a labyrinth of pain and despair. But the house did not stop. It continued. It would not free me, no matter how much I wanted it to. The house fed on me now, but not just on my body. It consumed my mind. Every thought, every sensation, every piece of who I was. Everything was being swallowed, distorted. I felt my soul being erased, as if I were being wiped from all the memories of the world, leaving nothing behind. I knew what would happen next. I would be nothing more than a shadow, a fragment of someone who once existed, an echo in the void. But more than that, I knew what the house wanted from me. It was not satisfied with what it had consumed. No, it wanted more. She wanted my essence. She wanted the last part of me that still resisted, my will to escape. And then, before the darkness consumed me completely, I heard a scream. A scream that was not mine. No. It was the scream of all those who had been devoured by the house, the scream of the trapped souls echoing within me. It was the scream of all those who, like me, had been consumed. And with that scream, I understood. The house did not want to let me go. It wanted me to be another forever. It wanted me to be the last soul it would swallow. And so I knew, in the depths of my mind, that there was no way to escape. I am the house now. I am the echo. I am the shadow. And perhaps you will become one too. Because in the house that devours minds, no one ever leaves. The silence of the house is the last breath. And it never ends. When reality unravels and silence screams, what will you do to escape the mind that devours you? I never liked my mother's house. As a child, I always found it strange, even suffocating. It was too big for a small family like ours. The hallway always seemed longer than necessary, and the stairs creaked with a strange sound, as if someone were always going up or down, even when no one was there. I used to ask my mother to let me sleep in her room, so I wouldn't have to spend the night alone in the heavy silence that hung over the house. When she passed away, I didn't feel like someone who had lost a mother. At least, not immediately. I wasn't sad, just relieved, if I can say it that way. I knew that something in me wasn't right. And maybe that was what haunted me the most, the fact that I didn't feel the loss the way I should have. After the funeral, I went to her house. I didn't know what to do with everything she had left behind. I didn't know how to deal with the drawers, the books, the objects that were in the same position my mother had left them. The house was intact, but at the same time, it felt like it was no longer the same. That smell of mold, of rotting wood, seeped into everything. But the worst of all was the silence. The absolute silence. The house seemed to be waiting for something, as if it were alive, breathing slowly, absorbing time. And when I took my first look at the house, I knew I was running from something. I knew there was something there. Something waiting. I didn't want to touch anything, but at the same time, I couldn't leave. So, I began to tidy up what I thought could be done. On the first day, everything felt normal, tiring, but normal. However, as night fell, something began to change. The atmosphere seemed to grow denser, more strange. I heard the rustling of curtains, a murmur coming from the hallway, and when I tried to investigate, I found nothing. That's when I saw the door at the end of the hallway. I didn't remember seeing it before. The door was slightly ajar, but not enough to pass through. It looked old, but solid. Something pulled me towards it. It wasn't a desire, but a need. It was as if something inside was waiting for me. As if it were the last piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was trying to put together. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The air around the door was so thick that it was almost impossible to breathe. I knew that opening that door would change my life forever. But curiosity was stronger. With a dry click, the doorknob turned, and the door swung open. Inside the room, what I saw was something I still can't quite explain. There were no furniture, just a large tapestry hanging on the opposite wall. It covered nearly the entire room, from end to end, with a pattern I repeated, almost hypnotic. I couldn't stop looking at it, as if something was drawing me closer. As I approached, I realized it wasn't just a pattern. It was a story. And at the center of the tapestry, there was a figure. A woman, with deep eyes and a sad expression. I didn't know why, but that figure seemed familiar. I recognized those eyes. They were my mother's eyes. With my heart racing, I reached out to touch the tapestry, and at the exact moment my fingers brushed the fabric, something happened. The whole house seemed to stop for a second. The sound of the wind, the rustling of the curtains, everything fell silent. And then I heard her voice. But it wasn't like any other voice. It was a soft whisper, as if it were coming from inside my own mind. "You've come back," I recalled in horror, and the tapestry moved. Not physically, but the sensation that something was shifting behind it, beyond the fabric screen, was palpable. And then I saw. In the corners of the tapestry, in the shadows, figures began to form. They were like silhouettes, but not human. Something that slithered in the shadows, something that watched. My mother's voice echoed again, but this time, it was stronger, more distant, as if coming from another place. "I knew you would return. I knew." My feet seemed to disobey me, but fear propelled me toward the door. I glanced one last time at the tapestry and, for a brief moment, thought I saw a smile. Not from my mother, but from something else, something that disguised itself as her, yet was not her. And the feeling that something was about to reach me, that it was watching me there, made my blood run cold. I went to the door and slammed it shut. My heart was in my throat, but the feeling of dread did not fade. The house was still silent, but it was an oppressive silence. As if I had awakened something, something that should not have been stirred. Something that watched me from every corner, from every shadow. When the door closed behind me, the air in the house seemed to change. No longer was there that deep silence, but something denser, oppressive. As if the house itself had sighed in relief for having locked me inside, as if now it had the control. I didn't know what to do. What was behind that tapestry? Who were those figures in the shadows? I needed to get out of there, but something held me back. Something inside me screamed to leave, but another part of my mind, a part of my soul that I barely recognized, pushed me to return to the room, to look one more time. The house seemed to twist around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every snap of wood, every sigh of the wind passing through the broken windows, felt like it was coming from within me. It was as if I were being consumed by it. I was trapped, and the worst part was not knowing whether I was trapped in a place or to something else, something I didn't want to understand. I went back to the hallway, and what I saw was even more disturbing. The picture of my mother, the one that had always hung in the entrance hall, was slightly crooked, which had never happened before. I knew my mother was meticulous about details, with every object in its place, and that painting was never out of place. But now, it was there, crooked, as if it had been tampered with. Those framed chains, those gilded frames that were aging over time, seemed to watch me in a peculiar way, as if they knew what was happening. I turned on my heels and stepped away, but the whispers started again. They weren't clear, but they were there, distant, intermittent, like muffled voices. They seemed to come from within the walls. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, but as I approached the room's door, the sound of the voices grew clearer. And then I heard them distinctly. "Come back." The voice was low, almost imperceptible, but I knew it was my mother. Or at least, it was something posing as her. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. It was as if I were being drawn by an invisible force, something I couldn't resist. Like a puppet. That night, time seemed to stand still. I knew hours were passing, but the clock in the room, that old pendulum clock my mother always liked, had stopped. Its hands didn't move, and as silence filled the house, I felt the weight of every second. Each of my movements seemed to be watched, amplified inside that house that now felt like a prison. I sat on the living room sofa, my eyes fixed on the tapestry. I could no longer look away. It felt like it was consuming me, enveloping me, as if it were the only true thing in that place. I felt drawn to it. But there was something more, something I didn't want to acknowledge. The tapestry seemed to be moving. I blinked, confused, but the figure of my mother, that woman in the forest, appeared to have distorted. Her features were sharper, but it was no longer her. Something strange was happening with the fabric. The shadows behind her began to take shape, as if something were emerging from within the tapestry. My mother's face twisted and transformed. It wasn't an image, but a presence. Something alive. I stood up quickly, fear paralyzing me. I was sweating cold, but my legs wouldn't respond. Terror engulfed me, and I knew, at that moment, that I was no longer alone. Something was there with me, somewhere, inside that house. That's when I heard the breathing. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The warm, heavy breath came from behind me. I turned abruptly, and what I saw nearly made me faint. In the doorway, on the threshold of the room, stood a figure. Its skin was pale, as if on the brink of death, and its eyes, those eyes. I knew I recognized them. They were my mother's eyes, but distorted, lifeless, soulless. They were fixed on me, and the expression staring back was not hers. It was not my mother. The figure slowly advanced. There was no rush, but the movement was unmistakable. I could no longer breathe. It was as if the room was closing in around me, as if the air was being sucked into it. And then the figure stopped. The shadow cast on the wall seemed to grow, swallowing everything around it. I knew you would come back, the voice hissed. It was not my mother's voice, but it was unmistakably hers. Something was happening, something I couldn't understand. I recoiled, but something held me back from leaving. There was no escape. The figure moved closer, and I could see more clearly. Its face was distorted, as if it had been tortured. The marks of a life filled with pain and suffering were visible, but the worst part was that there was something inside its eyes. Something that was not human. It came even closer and, with a slow movement, extended its hand towards me. His finger was stretched out, as if it wanted to touch my face. I tried to pull away, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was trapped, as if the house had imprisoned me. "You will never leave here," the voice whispered. And then the figure's face contorted into a twisted smile, something that did not belong to my mother. Something that was not human. The last thing I saw before I fainted was that smile. It was the smile of something that knew what I feared the most. When I woke up, I was no longer in the room. I was in the hallway, alone. But I knew nothing would be the same again. I had crossed a line I should not have crossed. And the house, it knew that. It knew I could never escape. I woke up with a feeling of emptiness. It was not a physical sensation, but something that was running through my veins, something that told me I was no longer alone, even when there was no one visible around me. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was the smell of mold, but mixed with something denser, like rotting flesh, something that infiltrated my lungs with every breath. The air was heavy, almost as if I were breathing water, and my body seemed unable to move properly. I was lying on the cold floor of the hallway, unsure how long I had been there. When I tried to get up, my hands touched something damp, something sticky. I glanced quickly at them, but there was nothing. Just the sensation that something had touched me, something that had left an invisible mark, now clinging to my skin. My heart was racing, and the tension in my chest was so strong I thought I might suffocate. I forced myself to get up, though my legs trembled and my vision was blurry. I tried to scream, but my throat felt clogged, as if something had silenced me. The silence of the house was more oppressive than ever. I knew that even in the darkness, something was watching me, but I couldn't see what it was. I was being followed. I was sure of that. I didn't look back because I knew what I would find, but the feeling of something behind me was constant. As if it were following me, a step behind, always. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop hearing the footsteps, the sound of something moving toward me. Slowly, patiently. I tried to run to the bedroom, where I had felt a little safer before, but the hallway now seemed bigger, longer. The shadows stretched and twisted, and at times I could swear I saw something moving among them. My eyes were alert, but with each step I took, the feeling of not being alone consumed me more. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house were breathing. When I finally reached my room, the door was ajar, but when I placed my hand on the doorknob, it slammed shut with a loud bang, as if pushed from the other side. I immediately recoiled, panic spreading in my chest. The sound of something dragging on the floor, heavy, as if watching me through the door, was the last warning before chaos. The lights flickered, and the moment they went out completely, the temperature dropped. The house was now cold, biting, as if the very air had turned to poison. In the dark, I felt a cold hand touch my skin, sliding along my arm, and the feeling of dread overwhelmed me like a wave drowning me. When the lights came on again, I saw it. It was there, in front of me. The figure. The pale, distorted face of my mother, now clearer than ever, but still with those lifeless eyes. But there was something else, something more in the shadows around her. In the background, a silhouette loomed, taller, more skeletal. The figure's head tilted to the side, as if assessing me, and then it did something that nearly made me faint. It smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was a twisted expression, something grotesque. Its teeth were broken, some missing, yet the smile was wide, as if it took pleasure in it. The sound of the smile was the worst of all. Like something stretching and tearing from the inside, something that shouldn't exist. Something that shouldn't be able to smile. "You're never going to leave," the voice said, but it wasn't just my mother's voice. It was something more, something that was now part of the house, as if the house itself were possessed. The sound was deep, torn, as if each word had been whipped from some distant, dark place. And then, without warning, the figure moved. Not with steps, but with a fluid motion, as if gliding, dragging itself. I felt the pressure in my chest increase, as if I were being crushed by the very presence of that thing. Something was reaching out to me, wrapping around me, an invisible but palpable force. And then, a voice came from inside my head, a voice that wasn't mine, but one I recognized. "You weren't supposed to come back. You never were." The shadows around began to move, to twist. I saw something rising from the ground, something that shouldn't be there. The house was alive. It was feeding on me. And with each passing second, the tapestry, that cursed tapestry, seemed to gain more life. The figures within it now projected outward, as if trying to swallow me. Every line, every color, every movement felt like a web that entrapped me more and more. I fell to my knees, my hands pressing against my head, trying to ward off the voices, trying not to hear what they were saying. But what terrified me the most was the fact that I knew this was just the beginning. The sound of heavy breathing I heard in the hallway started again, closer, louder. I looked to the side and saw my mother's eyes watching me. But it wasn't her. It was the thing passing for her. That entity, that presence pulling me into the abyss. The smile widened even more. "I knew you would come back. Now you are part of us." I could bear it no longer. The walls of the house began to close in, and the last thing I felt was a pressure in my chest, as if all the air was being pulled from me. Everything went dark. When I woke up, I was no longer in my house. I was somewhere else. But something told me that the house would never let me go. It was calling me. It knew where I was. And deep down, I knew I would never be the same. I no longer knew where I was. What was left of me was just a shadow, an echo of what I once was. Every time I tried to remember something, my mind scrambled into fragments, and I saw, in flashes, the house. The house that never left me. The house that would never let me go. After that, I didn't know if I was alive or dead. There was nothing real anymore, except a horrible sensation, a constant pressure in my chest, as if something was watching me. As if I was being observed all the time. Time, that concept I knew, seemed to have vanished. I didn't know if days, weeks, or years had passed since that thing took me. Since my soul, if I can still call it a soul, was ripped from me. I was somewhere. In a house, I think. But it wasn't my house. It was no longer my mother's house. It was different. The presence was there. That same feeling of being watched, of being devoured by something invisible. And the smell was the same. The smell of death. The smell of rotting flesh. I didn't know how I got there. But somehow, I knew it was an extension of the house, a branch of what had trapped me. And there it was, before me. The tapestry. It was no longer on the wall, but now on the floor, spreading like a blood stain, taking over the space, as if the entire house were made of fabric. The figures of the tapestry, those same distorted ones, now projected outward, writhing, stretching, as if trying to escape, as if the house was swallowing everything. And then the eyes. Those eyes. My mother's eyes. They were watching me, but there was no compassion left, There was no humanity, just emptiness. An emptiness that consumed everything around it. And those eyes were distorting. They became deeper with every second, more vacant. Yet still, they were looking at me. I heard the voice. I heard it clearly. That raspy voice, the same as before. You are not leaving. You will never leave again. She was right. I knew that now. The house had taken me. I was no longer a visitor. I was no longer an heir. I was part of it. That house, that entity, had transformed me. Like a tapestry weaving its fibers around something, ensnaring me until nothing remained. I tried to scream. I tried to do something. But my throat was dry. My mouth produced no sound. And that's when I realized I was no longer in control. I was no longer in command. I was being consumed, completely absorbed. The house was transforming me, and I could not escape. I looked at the corners of the room, and there they were. The figures, those that once seemed harmless, now moved. They were emerging from the tapestry, taking shape. Each of them had the same face. My mother's face. But it wasn't her. It was no longer the woman I knew. It was a mask. A lifeless mask. A mask that was now approaching me. The eyes were everywhere. In the tapestry. In the faces. In the shadows. And somehow, I knew that by looking at them, my own soul was being absorbed. As if each gaze, each movement, was a piece of me being torn away. Then the voices. They started to whisper, but they were no longer whispers. They were screams. Screams of pain. Screams of anguish. Screams of something that should never have been created. Something that should never have existed. You will be one of us. I could no longer think. There was nothing left in my mind except that feeling of profound despair, of something crushing me from within. I saw the figures advancing, one by one, with their crooked smiles, their empty eyes. I saw the tapestry, now covering the ceiling, the walls, the floor, taking over everything. There was no more space. There was no more air. And then, with a snap, everything went dark. The emptiness. The silence. And that smell. The smell of rotting flesh. And it was then that I realized, in one last gasp, that I was inside the house. I was no longer an observer. I was part of it. I was no longer me. I was the tapestry. The house never let me go. The night was cold, colder than I remembered from my childhood nights. The wind cut through the little house where my grandmother had lived, as if something invisible was trying to enter. I was alone, as usual since she had passed. But that night, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It had been years since I had touched the trunk. The old trunk my grandmother had left me, with its scratched and time-worn surface. It had been stored in the attic, in a corner where no one dared to touch. I had never cared about it until that day, when, for the first time, my curiosity turned into necessity. At 18, I finally felt entitled to know what my grandmother truly wanted from me. What did that legacy mean? What was inside the trunk? I climbed up to the attic, the steps creaking under the weight of my footsteps. The smell of dust and mildew filled the air, mixed with something I couldn't identify. Something metallic, as if time had shaped the very environment into a place of ominous signs. Upon reaching the top, I saw the trunk. It was covered with a thin tarp that seemed to have been placed there by someone who knew it should be hidden. When I removed the tarp, a wave of cold ran down my spine, as if something was watching me. The wood of the trunk was marked, not just by wear, but by something more. Scratches, deep marks, as if invisible claws had scratched it over the years. I couldn't help it, my heart raced. I didn't know what awaited me, but I needed to know. With a snap, the lid opened. The sound of metal scraping against wood reverberated through the attic, echoing in the solitude of the house. Inside, there was a book, with a dark leather cover, engraved with strange symbols on its surface. Beside it were some amulets, black stones, small clay figures, and a gold chain with an indecipherable pendant. The air was thick, nearly impossible to breathe, and I felt the urge to close the trunk immediately, but something stopped me. Something was pulling me in. I picked up the book, which felt heavier than it should, and opened it. The pages were worn, but the content was clear, as if it had been written yesterday. The words were incomprehensible, but the feeling they conveyed was clear. Something was about to happen. The symbols seemed to dance on the pages, as if they were alive, watching me. It was then that I heard the voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I knew it was her. My grandmother's voice. "Now you are the heir." Fear paralyzed me. There was no one around. I was alone. But the voice came from inside the house, as if it were crossing the walls. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me or if this was real, but I knew something was beginning. I blinked, and everything around me seemed to change. The shadows in the house began to move, dancing erratically, as if they were entities of their own, like specters wanting to break free. The silence was shattered by a crack from somewhere distant in the house, as if the very air was becoming denser. I closed the book, but a cold sensation ran across my skin, as if it had touched me back. I knew I could no longer ignore that chest, that inheritance. It had chosen me, and now I was the heiress. That night I couldn't sleep. The book, with its dark leather cover and mysterious symbols, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it awaited my touch once more. But I knew this was not something normal. There was nothing ordinary about that inheritance, and I began to question what my grandmother had truly left for me. I felt watched, as if every movement was accompanied by invisible eyes. I went to the mirror in the hallway, trying to calm myself, searching for some rational explanation for what had happened. But when I looked at my reflection, something was wrong. The image in the mirror was not the same. My face was pale, as if all color had been drained from me. But the strangest part was the gaze. My own eyes seemed empty, as if they were not mine. I touched the mirror, but the reflection didn't change. My heart raced. I didn't know if I was seeing things, if it was fatigue, or if something else was happening, something that couldn't be explained. I quickly stepped back and went down to the living room, where the chest still lay open. The silence in the house was oppressive, but there was something more, a presence. Something that was waiting for me. I could feel the tension in the air, as if something was about to break through reality. Suddenly, I heard the kitchen door slam. I walked over it, my feet dragging slightly, a sense of dread growing within me with each step. When I entered the kitchen, I saw something that froze me completely. A shadow, with indistinct outlines, was standing by the table. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, as if it were there just to watch me. The air was heavy, as if the entire environment had transformed into something denser, something darker. My body trembled, but somewhere inside me, there was a desperate need to know more. I needed to understand what was happening, why I felt that the whole house was alive, why the shadow wouldn't leave me. It knew I was there, and it was waiting for me to do something. That's when my grandmother's voice once again cut through the silence of the house. But it was not like the first time. It was no longer soft and distant. It was now clear and harsh, as if it were coming from inside me, as if my own mind were being invaded. "You have to continue, my dear. You cannot escape. The ritual has already begun. You are the chosen one." I almost fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the pressure the phrase caused. My body was hot and cold at the same time, as if being pulled into something irreversible. I looked at the shadow in the kitchen and saw it moving, slowly, in my direction. The walls seemed to distort around it, as if space were being consumed by the darkness itself. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. That's when the shadow spoke, with a hoarse, rough voice. "You can't go back now. What has begun cannot be interrupted. Your grandmother knew. She knew you would be the heir." The feeling of being watched intensified. I felt as if the entire house were filled with invisible presences, eyes fixed on every move I made. Each step I took seemed echoed by something that was there, waiting, yearning. The chest was open, and something seemed to call me back to it. Without thinking, I approached and picked up the book again. It was warm, almost boiling, as if it were alive, pulsing in my hands. But what happened next was even more insane. The book opened by itself, the pages flipping rapidly, until it stopped on a page filled with grotesque drawings and symbols I didn't recognize. The words seemed to move on the page, changing shape. rearranging themselves as if being written before my eyes. It was a message for me. You will be next. The inheritance is yours. And when you finish, there will be no one left. They will all be under your command. I took a step back, horrified. The house was beginning to transform. The air grew thicker, heavier, and the whispers were clearer now. Not just from my grandmother, but from other voices, distant voices, as if the walls were breathing with them. I was surrounded, encircled by something I didn't understand, something I couldn't see, but that was there, waiting. And then I realized. The house was not just a house. It was alive. It had been shaped by something ancient, something my grandmother had nourished. That presence, those whispers, were not merely ghosts. They were something more, something that had yet to reveal its true face. I tried to run, tried to escape. But the air seemed to bind me, as if I were being swallowed by something invisible. Each step was harder than the last, and before I knew it, I was back in the hallway, my hands trembling as the book lay open before me. It was then that I finally heard the most terrifying sound of all, the crack of breaking wood. It was not the sound of something physical. It was as if reality itself was splitting in half. I looked at the clock on the wall. Time had stopped. And I knew. There was no way out. My grandmother's legacy would consume me. I was the heir, and the ritual was already in progress. Now, it was too late. The sound of the crack echoed in my mind, each echo reverberating against the walls of the house, as if the very structure were collapsing. I tried to move, tried to react, but something held me there. The ground felt heavier, and each step became increasingly difficult, as if the wooden floorboards were stretching and contracting beneath my feet, like a slow, heavy breath. The feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me, filled every inch of my body. I didn't know what to do. I just knew I couldn't stay there. Yet I found myself walking toward the back of the house, as if some invisible force were dragging me. Each step brought me closer to a destination I didn't yet understand, but that was becoming clearer by the moment. The shadows in the house began to distort, stretching impossibly, as if they wanted to swallow me whole. I could see things moving in the shadows, figures crawling, slithering along the walls, shapeless but with eyes, many eyes fixed on me. I couldn't scream, couldn't move more than a few steps, until I finally reached my grandmother's room. There, everything was as it had been, but in a way I couldn't explain. The bed was empty, yet a sense of presence filled the air. I entered, and soon a cold breeze passed through me, making me shiver. The curtains fluttered, as if an invisible wind were pushing them. In the corner of the room, near the old mirror, a figure formed, blurring the boundaries of reality. I knew who it was before I even looked at her. It was my grandmother. Not the grandmother I remembered. Not the tired, elderly woman I loved. No, that was no longer my grandmother. She stood there, with empty eyes and a body twisted in a grotesque way, as if she were a puppet controlled by something beyond her will. Her hair was disheveled, and her once wrinkled skin now looked pale and sagging, as if it had been stretched too far. Her smile was distorted, forced, as if she was struggling to appear human. She watched me in silence, her eyes locked on mine, and I knew this was not a hallucination. This was my grandmother, but not as I knew her anymore. Then she spoke, but not with her soft, calm voice. Her voice now sounded like a metallic whisper, a voice that didn't originate from her lungs, but from something deeper. Something that crawled within her. You finally understand, don't you? What you carry, what you inherited. There is no turning back. My body froze. I didn't know how to respond. The words were stuck in my throat, as if the house itself had tightened around my windpipe. I wanted to get out of there, wanted to flee, but something prevented me from moving. The feeling of being trapped was unbearable. My grandmother approached slowly, her steps heavy and dragging, but she didn't touch the ground. Her feet lifted as if she were floating, moving in an unnatural way. She stopped in front of me, and the air became even thicker. The smell of something rotten invaded my nostrils, as if death were spreading through every inch of the environment. "Do you think you can escape?" she whispered, her mouth curling into a grim smile. "You cannot. The ritual has already begun, and you've already been a part of it. Now, all that remains is..." She stopped speaking. Her expression changed. as if she were listening to something distant. Something coming from within the house. I looked around, and then I saw it. At the back of the room, in front of the mirror, the walls began to pulse, as if the very heart of the house were beating. And then, a figure appeared in the reflection. It was another person. A man. But he wasn't standing. He was lying on the floor, his body twisted in an impossible position. His skin was torn in several places, and his face was expressionless, the eyes fixed, empty. He looked dead, but he wasn't. I felt, that he was still there in some way. That he was still trapped inside the house. He was the last, my grandmother said, her voice lower, almost inaudible. But now, are you ready for what comes next? Before I could ask what she meant, the walls began to contort even more, as if something inside them were trying to escape. The sounds became unbearable, a distorted and anguished scream coming from within the house, as if someone were being crushed. I didn't know where it was coming from, but I knew it was something that shouldn't be heard. And then, the mirror shattered. The figure that was there, the man who was lying down, splintered apart. The shards of glass fell to the floor, and something began to emerge from within them, something viscous, black, and shiny. They were hands, countless hands, reaching out to me, pulling out what remained of my sanity, as if trying to drag it into that dark abyss. I could no longer control my body. The hands began to pull me, my legs grew heavy, and my vision blurred. I couldn't breathe. The air was becoming denser, as if space itself were closing in around me. I was being consumed, and all I could do was remember the last thing my grandmother said to me, in her metallic and cruel voice. "Now you are the air." And then I fainted. When I woke up, the house was empty. But I knew, without a doubt, that this was not an escape. That house was no longer just in my past. It was inside me. And I didn't know how to get out. I woke up to the sound of the wind howling outside, but the house was strangely silent. The morning light streamed through the broken windows, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. I was lying on the floor of my grandmother's room, still in shock, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. But something was wrong. I knew the house hadn't let me go yet. It was here, inside me. I struggled to get up, my feet betraying me, wavering. The book was on my nightstand open. The smell of mold and something else, something putrid, filled the air. The feeling of being watched, of being invaded, consumed me. I looked at the bedroom door and saw it ajar. The mirror in the hallway was intact, reflecting an image that was no longer mine. I approached the mirror and stared at the reflection. My face was distorted, as if it were melting, as if the flesh were melting from within. My hands, pale and trembling, reached out to the glass, and when I touched the cold surface, the distortion worsened. The figure in the mirror was no longer me, but a version of myself with empty, black eyes, like dark holes sucking any trace of light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. It was then that I heard the whisper again. It wasn't just my grandmother now. The voices, the whispers, were everywhere. They were calling me. Some were soft, others violent, laden with pain. As if thousands of souls were trapped in that house, waiting, pleading, demanding that I do something. That I set them free. "You cannot escape, my dear." My grandmother's voice echoed in the air, cold and cynical. "You are now part of us. And the legacy you carry will be the end of everything." I tried to pull away, but the walls moved, the corridors narrowed, as if the house were trying to imprison me further. The air was thick and hot, my chest tight. I could barely breathe. I knew what my grandmother said was true. I was no longer just a victim. I had been chosen. The book appeared before me on the floor, as if it had shifted from somewhere. The pages were turning on their own, and a new message emerged, written more frantically, almost desperately. "Now you are next. Your soul, your flesh, your hands will be used. What your grandmother started, you must finish, or we will all be lost." I felt my hands still trembling, moving involuntarily. It was as if the book were controlling my own gestures, my own will. I was being dragged into a reality where I had no control. What was inside me, what my grandmother had left behind, was now the only thing guiding me. It was the only thing pushing me to move forward. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something were tearing my skin from within. I looked down but saw nothing. Just a growing pressure, something that wanted to escape. Something that controlled me. The walls began to deform even more. Distorted faces of people appeared, stuck to the walls, screaming, crying, begging to be let out, to be freed. But I knew that was not just a simple illusion. They were there. Trapped. Trapped by what my grandmother had done. Now you will understand. My grandmother's voice whispered once again, but it was no longer from some distant place. It was inside me, within my head, echoing in my thoughts. Everything you are, everything you will be, depends on you completing what was started. I could no longer fight against it. There was no chance to escape. My grandmother's legacy grew stronger, more present, more impossible to ignore. What she had done, what she had called into our family, was not a simple spell. It was not just magic. It was a curse. And I was doomed to carry it, to spread it, to perpetuate it. The book slammed shut with a bang. The house began to tremble. I fell to the floor, trying to grab onto something, trying to maintain my sanity. But the voices were screaming now, endless cries that cut through me, tearing me apart inside. I was losing my mind. I was being consumed. The house seemed to have transformed into a living prison, and I was the key to its release. The walls started to close in. The shadows crawled like snakes, swallowing the light, and I knew. There was no turning back. When the shadows finally surrounded me, one last voice echoed in the darkness. You are now the heir of the house. You will be the next to continue the cycle. And then, the darkness swallowed me. I never escaped that house. And no matter where I go, no matter how much time passes, I know it will always be with me. Because the legacy my grandmother left me is not something you can simply abandon. It is inside me, and it will never let me go. I am the heir of the house. And I know that one day, I will have to pass this on. Maybe you are next. I know you doubt the truth of this story, but the house always finds a way to remind us. And once you hear the call, it's too late to deny. You won't be able to escape. Because my grandmother's legacy, and mine, is waiting for you too. I used to think that legends were just stories to spark the imagination, something fun to tell around a campfire or to scare children. But what happened after I accepted that invitation changed my perception forever. I never looked at the world the same way again. It was an ordinary afternoon when my brother, Raphael, approached me with a strange glimmer in his eyes. He had a habit of inviting me on adventures, always suggesting something insane, but this invitation was different. Have you heard of the Mountain of Souls? He asked, in a tone that seemed to come from someone who knew much more than he was willing to reveal. I replied, somewhat skeptically, that I had heard the stories, like everyone in town, the mysterious disappearances, the legends of people who climbed the mountain and never returned, the whispers carried by the wind. But like any good horror story, it always seemed like a ruse to frighten curiosity away. Raphael, however, seemed convinced of something different. I'm going there, and I want you to come with me, he said with unusual confidence. I know what you're thinking, but I need you, man. It's not like the other expeditions. Something tells me this one is different. I fell silent. I didn't know if I was seeing an opportunity to finally test my courage or if I was just yielding to the impulse to follow my brother, as I always had. He handed me a crumpled note, and his gaze left no room for refusal. The invitation was clear. A group of 5 would gather to climb to the summit of the Mountain of Souls. The trip was set for the following Friday. I don't know exactly what led me to accept. Maybe it was boredom with my routine or an inexplicable feeling that if I declined, something worse would happen. The fact is that, in less than a week, we found ourselves at the foot of the mountain, ready to begin the journey. The road leading there seemed endless, with tight turns and a thick fog hovering over the path, almost as if it were trying to swallow us. When we finally reached the base camp, the landscape was desolate. The silence was heavy. The ancient trees, with twisted trunks, stood like sentinels frozen in time. There was no life there, nothing but the distant sound of the wind. I didn't want to admit it, but something inside me was already beginning to tighten. We set up our camp and lit the fire. No matter how hard we tried to talk, the atmosphere was tense. The cold, biting wind blew fiercely, and the flames of the campfire flickered, as if struggling to survive. But the strangest thing happened when we looked at the distant mountains. There was no one up there, but it felt like something was watching us. "Do you guys believe in those ghost stories?" asked Lucas, one of the other group members, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. I laughed nervously. "These are just legends, man," I replied, but even I knew it didn't feel right. That's when we started to hear the first whispers. We didn't know where they were coming from, but the voices were there, as clear as the wind, whispering something that seemed to call us. At first, we tried to ignore it, thinking it was just our imagination. But the intensity grew. Voices that sounded desperate, as if they were trying to warn us about something, but we couldn't understand. They made no sense, and that was the most disturbing part of it all. Victor, the last of the group, who always showed excessive bravery, tried to laugh. "It's just the wind," he said, but his voice was tense, the smile forced. When I looked at the others, I realized we all shared the same feeling. Something was wrong. What we didn't know was that this was only the beginning. That night, as we settled into our tents, a scream pierced the silence. It was Carlos, one of our friends, who was sleeping in the tent closest to mine. When I ran over, the tent was empty. Panic took hold of me, and soon we began shouting his name, searching everywhere. But what we found was even more terrifying. Nothing. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, just the emptiness stretching into infinity. Not even a trace of where he could have gone. As if he had simply vanished, swallowed by the mountain in the blink of an eye. At that moment, fear began to take over all of us. But deep down, we knew there was no turning back. Whatever that thing was, it was starting to hunt us. I know what you're thinking now. This is just a story, something made to scare. But what I'm about to tell you is something that really happened, and that's why I can't stop hearing the whispers. I am the last survivor, and not a single day goes by without me wondering how I got here. What happened to us, who accepted that invitation, is something I hope to never experience again. That dawn was like a curtain of terror unfolding before us. When Carlos disappeared, something changed inside me. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the silence surrounding us was more oppressive than any noise. We knew deep down that something was wrong, but like a group of fools, we kept searching. It was a futile search. The trees, which once seemed mere plants, now had an almost human shape. Their branches seemed to twist, to stretch, as if they were watching us. We shouted Carlos's name into the darkness, but nothing answered. Only the echo of our own despair. We tried to rationalize everything, thinking he might have wandered off on purpose, perhaps to toy with our minds. But what we found later, well, what we found was beyond explanation. It was Lucas who found the first signs. He was outside the tent, doing the rounds that had already become a routine. When he moved a little further away from the campfire, he shouted. I don't know how to describe what he saw, but what he brought back left us more than disturbed. He found marks on the ground, something that looked like a dragged trail. They weren't footsteps, it wasn't a run, but rather as if someone had been pulled. The ground was broken, the earth mashed in such a grotesque way that it seemed to be deformed. As if something was moving beneath the earth, pressing, trying to break free. It was a subtle movement, but impossible to ignore. He couldn't have gone this way, Lucas said, his voice faltering. What we didn't know was that when we saw the marks on the ground, we were already being watched. We still didn't know that. I didn't know until what happened next. When the morning light finally managed to pierce the fog, the sense of relief we felt was fleeting. The day brought with a terrible visibility but a superficial calm. We decided to explore further, trying to find any clue, any sign of where Carlos might have gone. The problem was that we couldn't stray far from the field. Something kept us there, trapped, as if the mountain had extended its invisible hands and imprisoned us. I clearly remember the moment the fog began to thicken again. The air, once fresh, became dense, a bit colder, and that's when we started to hear. Not the distant voices this time, but something much closer. As if something was breathing, unhurried, as if it was waiting, listening to our footsteps. But the worst part wasn't the feeling of being watched. It was the sensation that we were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. It was Raphael who heard it first, while searching near a rock formation. He stepped away from the group for a few minutes, and when he returned, he was pale, with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" he asked, as if he was about to faint. I saw something. Something moved." He tried to say more, but his voice was almost inaudible. We went to where he had been, and that's where we found the first evidence of something we couldn't comprehend, a symbol, carved into the stones. It wasn't something a person could easily make, because the marks seemed to have been made with some kind of knife or improvised tool, but the depth was unusual. The design initially looked like a circle, but upon closer inspection, you could see it branched out, expanded, almost as if the circle were alive. Something pulsing there, beneath the stone. I wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't. The symbol was a mark. And soon I recalled ancient stories, the ones my grandmother used to tell me. The mountain has eyes, and it recognizes those who ascend to it. Those who hear the whispers can no longer return. It was as if it had been made centuries ago, waiting for our arrival. And at the moment I saw that symbol, I knew we had been drawn to that place. The mountain was alive, and it didn't want to let us go. But we didn't yet know the worst. The following night was the most terrible of all. We were all so weak, so disoriented, that we didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. When the shadows began to stretch, and the campfire no longer burned as brightly, a sense of dread took hold of me. The voices began again, but now, they were no longer distant. They were inside our heads. And it was Victor's eyes, fixed on something far away, that made me realize that what we were hearing were not just voices. They were faces. The faces of people who had been there before. Or at least, their shadows. That night, everything changed. In the midst of the darkness, the mountain whispered Carlos's name. And no matter how much we screamed, his name seemed to come from within the stones, the trees, the wind. And then, he appeared. But he was no longer Carlos. He was no longer my friend. He was no one I knew. What stood before us was a distorted version of him, a body twisting in an impossible way, as if trying to adjust to its new form. His eyes were black, empty, as if he had been consumed by the mountain itself. He opened his mouth, but did not speak. Only silence stretched out, until finally, what was left of Carlos drifted away, into the darkness, with a grotesque smile, as if he already knew we would be next. And there, in that moment, I realized the truth that no one should ever discover. We were not on the mountain. The mountain was inside us. I know you're wondering how it's possible that I'm here, talking about this. How it's possible that I came out alive from that mountain. I don't have an answer that makes sense. What I can tell you is that I didn't return alone. And whatever happened there did not stay on the mountain. It haunts me to this day. When Carlos drifted away, it wasn't like he was leaving. He simply disappeared again. Like a shadow dissolving into the darkness, taking with it any trace of humanity. He was gone. But somehow, he was still there. There was no more time to cry or despair. We knew the mountain was consuming us, and if we didn't do something, the same would happen to all of us. Raphael was the first to succumb to fear. In the middle of the night, after a series of nightmares that left us practically drained, he simply started to scream. It made no sense. He was looking at the trees, his eyes wide as if he had seen something impossible. But the only thing he saw was madness taking over him. He turned to me, his eyes filled with absolute terror, and said in a trembling voice, "They are watching us. We are not the same anymore. The mountain chose us." I tried to ignore it, tried to give him some kind of comfort, but what he was saying was true, and I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to understand. The feeling that we were being consumed, dragged into an abyss with no return, began to become a palpable presence, tightening my chest, making it hard to breathe. As the sun set, the fog grew denser. The wind, once just a gentle whisper, now felt like a breath coming from the depths of something much older than any legend. We tried to devise a plan to escape, but the strange markings on the ground, the stones that seemed to move as we walked, and the whispers coming from within ourselves, from our own minds, paralyzed us. We tried to leave, move to the opposite side, but the more we tried, the more the mountain seemed to stretch, as if it were swallowing us, pulling us back. We were forced to spend another night. When the campfire went out, darkness swallowed us with a voracity I never thought possible. Each step felt heavier than the last. But the worst was yet to come. It was the smell that caught us first. A metallic, almost sweet odor like fresh blood, but with something more, something foul. It was as if the very soil was rotting, as if the earth were alive, breathing. We tried to ignore it, trying to believe it was just fear making us smell that scent. But soon we found ourselves face to face with what still haunts me today. Victor's body was the first to appear. I cannot, in any way, ask you to imagine what we saw, but I will try to tell you. Victor was in pieces. He was no longer a body. He was a distortion of flesh and bone, something that the most macabre of nightmares couldn't create. His face was completely disfigured. His eyes had shifted to the center of his forehead, and his mouth was grotesquely stretched, as if forced to smile eternally. The skin seemed to be stretched too tight, as if the mountain itself were molding his flesh. But the worst was not what we saw, it was what we felt. Victor was not dead. He was trying to speak to us. His lips moved, but there was no sound. Just those eyes, those horrible eyes fixed on us, pleading for something. I don't know what, but it was something we could not give him. I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't respond. The mountain was no longer just around us. It was inside me, controlling us. The fear, the anguish, the despair, everything I felt was condensing, turning into a presence that infiltrated my veins, my guts. It was the mountain that was possessing me. And then, something none of us could foresee happened. The voices returned, but they were no longer distant. They were inside our heads, as if something were trying to enter directly into our thoughts. There was no way to escape. I tried to scream, but the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. And in the silence that followed, the truth was revealed. There was nothing left there. Not even my friends were truly there. What remained of them was being consumed, transformed by the mountain itself. We were no longer people. We were just echoes of something much older, a force that had already dominated those who dared to enter. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go home. But there was no home to return to. There was no escape. I don't know how, but I started to run, or at least I tried. The ground seemed to crumble beneath my feet, as if the earth was trying to swallow me, to sink me. Every step felt like it took me further away from any possibility of salvation. When I woke up, I was back at base camp alone. The sun was already low, but the camp was empty. There was no tent, no sign of life. Just the echo of the mountain around me. And then I heard the last thing I should have ever heard. Carlos's voice, weak, distant, but unmistakable. He was calling me. But I knew. He was not Carlos. He would never be Carlos again. And the mountain would not let me leave. It possessed me. Now, every time I close my eyes, I hear the whisper of the mountain. Every time I walk around, I feel like something is watching me. As if I returned with something from there. I don't know if I'm the only one who hears it, but I can guarantee you one thing, the mountain does not forget. And if you are ever called by it, don't accept. I am proof that if you hear the whisper, you won't be the same anymore. And it won't be you who comes back. When I thought I could escape the mountain of souls, I realized that the true nightmare had only just begun. Those shadows that hunted us, the voices that dragged us, were not just echoes of the past. They were waiting, anticipating our fall. Whatever possessed me that was not content with simple domination. It wanted to take me back. And worse still, it wanted to show me what we truly are. I thought I would find peace when I finally escaped that place, but it was a fatal mistake to think that way. The outside world, the people, the days, everything feels like a blur now. As if time itself had warped. But it wasn't time that had changed. It was me. When I woke up at base camp, alone, a sense of déjà vu washed over me. There was no tent, no signs of the others. What remained of them was not human. The mist enveloping the mountain felt like an invisible prison, as if it was drawing me back, pulling me with the force of an invisible magnet. I tried, with all my strength, to run. I moved away as fast as I could, but the air was heavy. The fear, that primal fear, was in every step. But what made me stop was not exhaustion. It was the sound of Carlos's voice. It was him, but it wasn't. That voice had something strange about it, something that no longer belonged to humanity. It resonated in a way that seemed to come from deep within the earth, from the mountain itself. There was no life in it. But at the same time, it was there, pleading for me to return. You don't understand, do you? Carlos's voice whispered. I can't leave. And neither can you. I looked back, and although I didn't see anything immediately, I felt that something was watching me. Something that was no longer my friend, nor anyone else I knew. I knew the mountain didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to become part of it. Trying to maintain control, I began to learn. I knew that if I looked back, I would see something I would never be able to forget. But with every step I took, the ground seemed to change. The earth gave way beneath my feet, as if I were sinking into something deep and viscous. Then I saw. At the edge of the forest, something began to take shape in the shadows. At first, they were just distorted figures. But slowly, they became defined, taking on a human form, but grotesque. They were my friends. Or at least, what was left of them. Their faces were unrecognizable, torn apart, as if they were being consumed by something shapeless. Their bodies were deformed, their legs and arms stretching in impossible ways. But the worst part wasn't their bodies. The worst part was the empty look they carried, as if they were no longer human. You are one of them now, a voice murmured, but I couldn't identify where it came from. Carlos, Rafael, Victor, they all spoke, but it was as if multiple voices were merging, one over the other, echoing in my mind. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run away. But their eyes, those distorted eyes, trapped me. And then, the most disturbing of all, I began to realize that I was no longer alone. The mountain of souls hadn't just been watching us. It had marked us. It had left a piece of itself in each of us. And now, that piece had awakened. The air grew even denser. The ground transformed into something slippery and sticky, as if I were walking on skin. The trees around me began to move, not in a natural way, but in a predatory manner. And I saw something even more horrific. From within the forest, something was emerging. It was not human. It was nothing that could be described in words. It was a mass, a mixture of flesh and darkness, something that stretched and twisted, as if feeding on the very essence of the mountain. Then one final voice rose up, the clearest of all, and it came from within me, from my own mind. You will never leave. You will never escape. That's when I understood. Whatever was in the mountain of souls wouldn't let us go. It took us, transformed us. We were no longer people. We were no longer human. We are just shadows, shadows that are part of the endless cycle of torment of the mountain. I tried to run one more time, but the shadows caught up with me. Now, when someone asks me what happened on that mountain, I don't know what to say. I no longer know what is real and what isn't. What I can guarantee you is one thing: the mountain is alive. And you have no idea what it means to be chosen by it. I am proof that once you hear the whispers, you don't go back. And now I am trapped here, with all the others, in the cycle, on the mountain of souls. And you? Have you heard? I have never been one to be impressed by death. I worked for years in funeral homes, and the smell of wax, wood, and cemetery became as familiar as the smell of coffee in the kitchen. When you deal with bodies every day, you learn to be indifferent. The pain, the mourning, and the heavy silence of funerals become just another part of the job. However, one afternoon, something changed. Something that still haunts me today. It was a day like any other. The muggy summer heat was there, but it was nothing I couldn't bear. I was alone in the storage room, organizing the coffins and preparing the ground for the funerals happening in the small town. The village was small, very small, and seemed to have more graves than inhabitants. It was a forgotten place, where the residents seemed to be buried faster than they aged. The coffin arrived in an old van, the driver frowning with concern. He got out with a blank expression, handing me the package without a word. The body, according to him, was that of a young person who had died under mysterious circumstances, although no one really knew what had happened. It wasn't uncommon to hear such stories around here, but I never questioned the details. For us, those working in the death industry shouldn't get involved in such matters. The coffin was simple, made of dark wood, without adornments. When I placed it on the stand, I noticed that the weight felt a bit heavier than that of a normal body. The lid was tightly fitted, and the only thing that caught my attention was a piece of fabric, a thin black veil, covering the coffin. It wasn't something I was used to seeing. I knew that bodies were prepared with respect, but that didn't seem right. Still, I ignored the discomfort I felt. Death, after all, had never been personal to me. I took a blade and carefully cut the seal of the coffin. The air in the storage room felt denser now, and a strange sensation began to grow within me, but I stood firm. I had dealt with hundreds of corpses. It wouldn't be a young person dead under mysterious circumstances that would shake me. I lifted the lid, ready for one last look. That's when I saw the face of the dead. It was not common to see such a young corpse in my line of work. The body was intact, which was already peculiar. However, what made me stop was the veil. It was stretched, covering the deceased's face flawlessly, as if it were part of the corpse itself. But I knew it wasn't. I had never seen such a thin veil, so perfect. It was like a shadow, almost ethereal, moving subtly, as if it were alive. I tried to pull it away, but something happened. The fabric wouldn't budge. It was as if it were glued to the skin of the dead, as if the veil had fused with the flesh in a way I had never witnessed before. With each attempt, the pressure in my chest increased, as if an invisible force was preventing me from moving forward. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening, and it was at that moment that I realized the air was denser, heavier, and seemed to tighten around me. I knew I should call the police. Something was not right. I couldn't keep touching the body, not with that feeling of oppression. But before I could grab the phone, a low voice, almost a whisper, echoed in my mind. "You cannot lift the veil." It was a statement, not a question. It made no sense, but it scared me in a way I couldn't explain. I went to the phone, still feeling as if something was watching me. I called the police, and soon they arrived, saying nothing about what they knew of the coffin. They merely looked at the body and, with visible effort, tried to remove the veil. But like me, they couldn't succeed either. Then, when they finally managed to open the coffin and take out the corpse, something that left me paralyzed happened. The young man's body vanished. There was nothing there, except for the veil, which seemed to be waiting. The black veil was there, pristine, stretched at the bottom of the empty coffin. It was impossible. No one would believe me, but I knew what I had seen. I knew the veil was more than just a piece of fabric. It was waiting for something, for someone. And when the authorities departed, bewildered, without answers, I still felt the weight of it on my shoulders. That feeling, something was approaching. Something I couldn't see, but that I felt, watching me, waiting for me. The worst, however, wasn't what happened that day. The worst was yet to come. And that, I didn't know how to prevent. I always thought death was just a natural cycle, something beyond anyone's control. I spent my days in a small funeral home office, where the routine of preparing bodies and dealing with the details of farewells became increasingly monotonous. In such a small town, mourning was a constant, and I became immune to it. But everything changed on a muggy summer afternoon when a simple coffin arrived, changing my life forever. It was a Thursday when the body was brought to the depot. The hearse arrived with a creak, almost as if protesting. The driver, an elderly man with a distant look, didn't say a word as he got out of the vehicle. He simply opened the back door and carefully took out the coffin, placing it gently on the cement floor of the garage. I watched him in silence. The coffin was simple, made of dark wood, nothing special to attract attention. But there was something in the air that left me uneasy, as if I knew something was not right. The young man inside was from a well-known family in town, but no one spoke about the cause of death. When you work with the dead, you quickly learn not to question the reasons for their deaths. But in this case, the silence seemed to carry a strange weight, as if there was more to the story than they were telling me. I entered the storage room, where the coffin was already positioned on the stand. Everything seemed normal, but soon I realized that something was out of place. The veil, a piece of black fabric, thin as silk, was carefully placed over the face of the deceased. It was a veil I had never seen before, and its presence caused me an inexplicable discomfort. I had never seen a coffin prepared with something like that. It was as if it was waiting for me, as if it were part of a ritual. Something I shouldn't touch. I tried to convince myself it was just another detail for the family, a symbolic gesture, but something inside me said otherwise. As I approached, I felt a pressure in my chest, an inexplicable weight that prevented me from breathing normally. With each step I took, the air seemed to grow denser. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, but as always, I followed protocol. I lifted the coffin lid, my heart racing, but when I looked at the young man's face, a sense of disconnection overtook me. His face was too intact, perfect, as if shaped by hands that did not belong to this world. And the veil was there, stretched over his face in an almost supernatural way, as if it were an extension of the corpse itself. There were no wrinkles or folds in the fabric. It seemed to float gently over the skin, as if it were not flesh but something ethereal. With trembling hands I began to pull the veil, not quite understanding why I was doing this. I knew I should just prepare the body and move on, but that veil challenged me. I tried and tried, but I couldn't remove it. Each time I pulled, the veil seemed to tighten, as if glued to the deceased's face. And then it happened. The air grew denser, and a feeling of oppression engulfed me, as if something was watching me. With each attempt to remove the veil, the surrounding environment seemed to close in, as if I were being swallowed by an invisible presence. That's when I realized something was very wrong. Something beyond what anyone could imagine. I felt a voice echoing in my mind, a faint voice, almost a whisper, but clearly directed at me. You cannot remove the veil. It wasn't a question. It was an order. And at that moment, I knew I was not just dealing with death. I was dealing with something much darker, something that did not belong to this world. I should have stopped, but fear and curiosity blinded me. Instead, I ran to the phone and called the police. Something told me this was not a simple situation. Something more was happening, and I needed help. When the police arrived and opened the coffin, it was too late. The young man had vanished. There was nothing there, except the veil. The fabric was stretched at the bottom of the coffin, as if waiting for something else, for someone. That's when I realized that veil was not just an accessory. It was the harbinger of something much greater. And somehow, he chose me. When the police left, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just any feeling. It was as if something had entered the room, something that shouldn't be there, something that observed every movement I made, every breath I took. The investigators said little, nothing significant. They just took notes, snapped a few photos of the empty coffin, and left. The strangest part was that no one touched the veil. I stood there, alone, with that fabric, which now felt more like a threat than anything else. I stared at the veil for a long time. It was there, at the bottom of the empty coffin, as if waiting for something. It was no longer just a simple piece of cloth. It was no longer just a black fabric. It was a symbol. Something I couldn't comprehend, but felt I needed to understand before it was too late. The fear was still fresh, but curiosity overtook me. What could be so strange, so out of the ordinary, as to make a person's body disappear? The following days were the worst of my life. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me for a second. I felt as if I had a shadow behind me, always on the periphery of my vision, but when I looked, there was nothing. Every sound in the storage made me jump. The wind hitting the window, the creaking of the wood, the sound of footsteps that didn't belong to anyone. I knew I was becoming paranoid, but the feeling that something was wrong was undeniable. That night, after a series of strange dreams, nightmares featuring figures with black eyes and distorted smiles, I woke up suddenly. The room was engulfed in an oppressive silence. I was sweating cold, my heart racing. I got out of bed, feeling an unbearable pressure on my chest, as if being squeezed by an invisible hand. I looked at the clock, 3:17 a.m. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep again, so I decided to go out. The street was deserted, and the only light was from a street lamp flickering in the wind. Fear still followed me, but something stronger urged me to return to the storage, to the coffin. When I arrived, something felt different. The air was denser, heavier. The door was ajar, as if someone had come in and out without leaving a trace. The dim light from the hallway lamp illuminated the storage in a macabre way. The atmosphere was cold, as if the very space had been consumed by a presence that shouldn't be there. The coffin was exactly where I had left it, but something had changed. The veil. It was more vibrant, as if subtly moving, breathing with a life of its own. I didn't know if I was seeing it due to exhaustion or if something truly was happening, but it felt impossible. The veil was alive, and it was waiting for me. I approached hesitantly. I didn't want to, but I couldn't pull away. There was an invisible force drawing me in, like a magnetism. I approached slowly, my hand trembling as I touched the fabric. It was cold, yet at the same time, the touch felt strange, as if it were made of something more than just cloth. Something more macabre. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand over my own, as if someone were touching me from inside the coffin. An invisible force took hold of me, and I tried to pull my hand back, but it was too late. The coffin lid slammed shut violently, and a muffled scream, a kind of whisper, came from inside. Something was trapped there. I could no longer control my body, as if I were being possessed by a force beyond my understanding. The veil began to stretch outward, as if trying to escape, as if the very fabric wanted to consume me. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. I fell to the ground, exhausted, feeling as if the world around me had vanished. I didn't know if I was dreaming, if it was a delusion brought on by fear, or if it was all real. But looking at the coffin, something made me understand that there was no turning back. The young man's body had vanished, but the veil was there, stronger, more present than ever. The next morning, things took an even more terrible turn. Those close to me began to die, one after another, like dominoes falling. My brother, who had always been healthy, suddenly died of a heart attack. A friend, who was fine the night before, was found dead in bed, with a look of horror frozen on his face. There was no explanation. They were fine. They had no reason to die. But I knew the truth. Each of them had, at some point, touched the veil or been near it. I had seen them. Each one. Every glance, every touch. And then, when they were gone, only emptiness remained. That was when I realized the worst. The veil was with me. It was in my life, like a shadow, a curse. And I knew that sooner or later, it would come for me. There was no escaping it. There was no fleeing. To this day, I feel its presence. It is in my home. In my life, watching. The veil, with its macabre promise, is always there, lurking. And when I look in the mirror, I see something more. Something that should not be reflected. It's as if it is watching me now too. As if death is waiting for me. And no matter how much I try to run, I know it is getting closer. Waiting. And when my time comes, I will not be able to escape. In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched intensified in a way I never thought possible. I was already accustomed to fear. It came with the job, with the routine of dealing with death. But what I was feeling now, a viscous, suffocating sensation, was completely different. It was not just fear. It was dread. Something insane, something visceral. With each new dawn, the events seemed to worsen. The deaths around me showed no signs of stopping. They were no longer just people from my family or close friends. I started to see acquaintances bidding farewell to me, never to return. As if an invisible evil was falling upon everyone I touched. Each of them had something in common, something I only realized too late when I began to make the connections. They had all, at some point, in some way, crossed the path of the veil. It was as if it spread, leaving a trail. It infiltrates people's lives subtly, disguised as coincidence. The veil was not something I could see physically, but I felt it. It was a constant presence, a sense of darkness that followed me, spreading, enveloping everything around me. And I knew that what was happening to others, what was happening to me, was a condemnation. The mark of something that could not be avoided. That the veil, with its silent darkness, was slowly consuming my last strengths. One night, completely exhausted, not knowing what else to do, I decided to return to the storage. Something told me I needed to face it once and for all, or at least try. I knew there would be no peace until I did. The storage felt colder, darker that night, and the atmosphere was denser, almost as if the very space was being suffocated by an invisible pressure. Everything was wrong. Upon entering, I was met by a disturbing silence. The sound of my footsteps echoed uncomfortably against the concrete walls, but there was something more. Something that hadn't been there before. A presence, something I couldn't see, but could feel with chilling clarity. I looked at the coffin. It was in the same place, but the veil was now denser. It was no longer just a piece of black fabric, but a mass, a substance that seemed to move before my eyes, as if it had a life of its own. I approached slowly, fear now paralyzing my body. I don't know why, but something told me I needed to touch the veil. The same insane impulse that had guided me when I first saw it months ago. Something was calling to me. A voice, perhaps, something whispering in my mind. With trembling hands I touched the veil. It was as if reality itself had distorted. The touch was cold, yet at the same time, it felt like I was touching fire. The heat and cold mixed into an unbearable sensation. I felt something tearing inside me, something breaking, something ripping me apart from within, as if I were being drained. And then I saw the face of the young man, the corpse that had vanished, appear before me, but not as the body I had seen in the coffin. It was distorted. The face, which should have been pale and lifeless, was now in an expression of absolute horror, the eyes wide, the mouth open in a silent scream. And the veil was stuck to his face, as if it were an extension of the skin, of the flesh. No, it was not just a veil. It was part of him, part of his soul. And he was alive. Or at least something that still resembled life was there, trapped in that macabre image. My heart raced. I was frozen, unable to move. The sensation of terror was so intense that I almost lost consciousness. The young man's face seemed to distort, the contours deforming, and a hand, pale and thin like a specter, slowly rose from the coffin. It stretched out, as if seeking something, someone. And the fabric of the shroud, now heavier and denser, seemed to pull him out, as if he were trying to escape from it. And then, it was the sound that made my body give in. A muffled sound, like the murmur of a language I didn't understand, coming directly from inside the coffin. It was a voice, not human. More like something that couldn't exist in this world. And with that sound, the shroud moved in an unnatural way, and I saw a figure with deep black eyes, a distorted silhouette, seeming to float above the corpse. And it looked at me, watching me, with an indescribable malice. I could no longer breathe. My chest was compressed, my whole body curled up in fear. The figure inside the coffin, now more defined, began to speak, but not with words. It was a presence, a sensation that I felt in every fiber of my being. I knew what I wanted to say without a single word being uttered. Now you are part of this. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I tried to move away, but my legs were paralyzed. The coffin began to tremble, and the shroud, now completely alive, stretched and expanded like a dark stain swallowing everything around it. It moved closer to me, crawling slowly, as if beckoning me inside. I knew what it wanted. It wanted to envelop me. It wanted to consume me, to turn me into yet another part of that damned cycle. And at the moment the shroud touched my skin, darkness enveloped me completely. Today, I still feel it, around me, inside me. The shroud never left me. It is with me now. And if you are listening, know that it is there too, watching you, waiting for the right moment. The shroud does not forgive. It simply waits, silent, until you are the next to succumb to its shadow. I no longer know what is real. The line between what is truth and what is happening inside my head distorts every day. I am in a constant state of alertness, as if something is watching me every second. And it feels like I am sinking, losing myself in an irreversible way. Every night, when I close my eyes, I feel the shroud around me, almost like a suffocating embrace, pulling me to the depths of an abyss from which I can no longer escape. Days have passed, but the faces of the people I lost are still in my mind, like shadows dragging along, whispering my sins. I know I was responsible for them. Each one of them, my brother, my friend, every person who touched the shroud. They are with me, and something inside me says that, somehow, I will be part of this cycle forever. I was at home, sitting in the dark, trying to ignore the weight in my mind when I heard the sound. A whisper, a low murmur coming from somewhere nearby. Something pulled me to the center of the room, where, on the floor, the veil appeared. It was there, resting, with dark, twisted edges as if it had a life of its own. The same veil that had consumed everything I loved was now in my house, before me. I knew in that moment what I needed to do. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place. And the truth, the horrible truth, hit me with the force of a hammer. The veil was not just a curse. It was a condemnation. But it was not for everyone. It was for those who, in some way, became worthy of its presence. Something in me had drawn the veil. Something in my being, something I could not escape, was connected to it, like an invisible thread running through my soul. I had been marked from the beginning. I struggled to rise. The feeling of being watched crushed me, but now I had no choice. I needed to end this. I needed to end my own pain. The life I knew was already consumed, shattered. I knew that if I did not do this, there would be nothing left. I would have to live with the pain and fear forever, like everyone else. With trembling hands I took the veil. It was no longer cold like before. It was warm, almost burning my skin. When I touched it, something inside me broke. A searing, deep pain that made me fall to the ground. The veil was consuming me, swallowing my soul, tearing everything inside me apart. But at the same time, a feeling of relief. As if the pain was dissipating, as if I was being freed from something worse. It was then that I heard it. The whisper. But it was no longer a weak whisper. It was a voice, clear and distinct, coming from within the veil. I recognized it immediately. The voice was that of the young man I had buried. That body that had vanished. He was there, somewhere inside that veil, speaking to me. He called to me, promising me something I did not understand. Something I knew I should not accept. And that's when the truth hit me. The final truth, the terrible one. The veil was not just consuming people. It was not just taking their souls. It was collecting them. I was not dying. I was not being consumed as I thought. I was becoming part of something much bigger. Part of a web of death, where each lost soul became a piece. I did not know exactly what it was, but I knew there was no turning back. And as I sank into that darkness, in the last moment before completely losing control of myself, a vision paralyzed me. I saw all those who had died. I saw the face of my brother, of my friend. They were there, their expressions now empty, as if they were waiting. And they were all around me, deep in the darkness. They didn't look at me with anger. They didn't look at me with sadness. They looked at me with understanding. I saw the veil, now thicker, stretching to completely envelop me. It was making me a part of it, turning me into yet another soul to be consumed, another piece in its web of death. But before being swallowed, before being fully consumed, I heard that voice again, that distorted voice echoing in my mind. Now you will be like us. You will be with everyone forever. I don't know what happened next. What I know is that now, when I look in the mirror, what I see is no longer me. I see the veil. I see all of them. The shadows, the lost souls, all looking at me. And when the wind blows, I can hear the whispers. They are always there, watching me. And I know you are being watched too, no matter where you are. The veil is already behind you. It is waiting, waiting for the right moment. And when your time comes, you will have no way to escape. I always knew that my Aunt Margaret was not an ordinary woman. She was eccentric, but not in a cheerful or funny way. Her reclusiveness, the way she avoided contact with others, always made me uncomfortable. And although she never spoke openly about it, everyone in the town of Blackwood knew enough to understand that she was involved in things that no one wanted to touch. When she passed away, the sense of relief in the town was almost palpable. However, for me, the weight was different. I was informed that I inherited her house and all her belongings, and unlike other relatives who shunned responsibility, I accepted the legacy without a second thought. Like any heir, I thought the house, the old property on the hilltop, was a piece of family history worth preserving. I was so wrong. I arrived in Blackwood on a chilly autumn morning. The wind cut through the skin, and the town seemed deserted, as if all the residents knew something was about to happen and didn't want to be around. My aunt's house was far from the center, where the streets were empty and the trees, which had never been pruned, sprawled like twisted, cold fingers. The building was large, with tall windows and a facade that seemed designed to intimidate, with its stone walls stained by moisture and time. I was greeted by an old lawyer. who handed over the keys and said a few empty words about how my aunt was somewhat eccentric, and no one truly understood her. What he didn't say, and what I would soon come to discover, was that she harbored a dark secret. The house was permeated with the smell of mold and aged wood. I walked through the wide, empty rooms, where the furniture was covered with white sheets, as if the house itself was trying to hide from reality. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards and the echo of my breathing. It was in the attic that I found the first item that seemed out of place. A black framed mirror, covered with a velvet cloth, lay on an aged table. I touched it, hesitantly, and something unsettled me immediately. The velvet was cold to the touch, as if it were made of something that shouldn't be there. When I removed the cover, a shiver ran down my spine. The mirror was large, almost disproportionate for the space. But what made me shudder wasn't the size or the ornate frame. It was the reflection. What I saw in that glass was not my reflection. The mirror seemed to show something beyond reality, as if it were transporting me to another place. The colors were distorted, the outlines of the surroundings were blurred, and the shadows danced erratically. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The feeling of being watched grew, not by myself, but by something else, something that was within the mirror. In a sudden impulse, I covered the mirror again, and a sense of relief washed over me. But something told me that what I had touched would not be easy to forget. I continued to explore the house, each room more oppressive than the last. When I entered the library, something caught my attention, an old book on a shelf hidden behind a secret wall. As I pulled it out, I heard a metallic sound, as if an ancient mechanism had been triggered. The wall opened with a protesting noise, revealing a grimoire. The leather of the book was worn, and the pages seemed to have been touched by dirty, eager hands. Curiously, I began to flip through it, and soon I realized that the texts were not ordinary. Rituals, spells, and words in a language I could not identify. I should have closed the book right then, but something pushed me to continue. I knew my Aunt Margaret was involved in something dark, but what had she done? What had she sought? And why suddenly did an unbearable feeling of dread begin to grow within me, as if the house itself were aware of my presence? That night, alone and consumed by curiosity, I decided to attempt one of the rituals. It was not a wise decision. I knew that deep down, but the idea of understanding what was happening overwhelmed me. The instructions in the book were clear, yet at the same time, there was something sinister in each word, as if they whispered in my mind. Invoke that which cannot be seen, but has always been there. Those words were written in red ink. I was consumed by the urgency to try, not realizing I was opening a door that could never be closed again. As I performed the ritual, the house reacted in a way I could never have imagined. The air grew heavy, and a sense of urgency, of something approaching, took hold of me. The shadows on the walls writhed, coming to life, and I heard low laughter, as if it were coming from within the house itself. My hands began to sweat, and a terrible pressure squeezed my chest. When I looked into the mirror, I saw something I would never be able to forget. My Aunt Margaret was there, or at least, what remained of her. Her eyes were empty, and her smile was grotesque, something that left me paralyzed with fear. "You finally understand, my dear," she said, with a voice that seemed to come from all corners at once. "Now, the inheritance is yours." I wanted to scream, to run, but terror immobilized me. The house was alive, and I had inherited something far more terrible than I could have imagined. And now, I understand. There is no escape. That night, the house was never the same. The atmosphere was dense, as if the air was thick and laden with something unbearable. When I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the mirror, my body was trembling, not from cold, but from something much deeper, something that could not be explained. The darkness seemed to move, to writhe, as if it were alive. I stepped away from the mirror in a hurry, but something prevented me from breathing normally. An oppressive feeling overtook me, and the house, with its dirty, creaking walls, became a large coffin. I tried to escape to the bedroom, but when I entered, I realized I was no longer alone. I wasn't alone, but I felt a presence, something watching me from the shadows, hidden in a way I couldn't see clearly. The air was icy, a chill that didn't come from the night outside, but from inside the house itself. I saw, somewhere in the darkness, a figure moving slowly, almost as if it were floating. The laughter, that laughter I had heard before, returned. It wasn't laughter of joy or playfulness. It was a deep, grave laugh, as if a decomposing body was trying to laugh, or as if something of an ancient, forgotten nature was reveling in my distress. I didn't know where it was coming from, but I felt it in every corner of the house, in every space I looked. A muffled, continuous, relentless laugh. The book. I knew I should have left the book alone. I knew, but like an obsession, I couldn't pull away from it. However, when I picked up the grimoire again, something made me stop. The pages were now different. They were no longer just with lead ink, but seemed stained, as if some viscous liquid had seeped between the leaves. I tried to ignore it, but a word appeared in the center of the page, written in a macabre handwriting. "Come." My aunt's voice, or what was left of her, still echoed in my mind. "Now the inheritance is yours." I no longer knew what was real and what was delusion. I felt the pressure building, as if something was watching me, something that didn't want me to understand the truth, something that wanted to possess me, to transform me into what they were. I was drawn by temptation, as if being pulled by invisible threads. The house's clock, which had never worked before, began to chime. The hours dragged on, yet I couldn't sleep. I was exhausted, but I couldn't close my eyes. Something inside the house, something I couldn't see, was watching me. The night dragged on, and when the light of dawn finally flooded the room, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I was no longer alone. Not in the simplest sense. It wasn't just the sounds, the whispers. There was something physically present. Something invisible, yet tangible. I began to hear footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps, as if something had been dragged across the wooden floor. The sound was coming from upstairs. I got up, my heart racing, and went to the stairs. When I placed my foot on the step, an invisible force pushed me back down, causing me to fall backwards onto the cold floor. The sound of the footsteps continued, but now louder, closer. I knew what was happening. Or rather, I knew that I didn't know. Whatever it was, whatever had stayed there for so long, was now becoming real. I was at the center of a ritual, a macabre game, in a setting created by my aunt. The mirror, the grimoire, the shadows, everything was connecting. The next night, unsure of what else to do, I sat in front of the mirror, hoping to find some answer. I was alone in the house, but something inside me told me I was not truly alone. When I looked at the reflection, I did not see my image, but that of my Aunt Margaret. She was standing in front of me, with those empty eyes like two dark caverns. Her smile, however, was different. It was a smile of triumph, something sinister. "You'll never get out of here," she said, her voice now clearer, yet still laden with a presence that left me breathless. I couldn't move. The house was filled with laughter again, but this time, the voices were now whispers. They were clear, loud, and seemed to come from within my own head. I felt as if my mind was splitting, as if something had taken over me and was forcing me to see what should not be seen. But the most disturbing thing of all was not the mirror, nor the laughter, nor the grimoire. The most disturbing thing was when the house, in a silent scream, began to change. The walls, which had previously been covered in dust, now pulsed, as if they were alive. The wood creaked, but with a different frequency, as if it were breathing. The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. The air became denser, heavier, and I realized that the house was closing in around me. I tried to run, to get out of there, but fear paralyzed my legs. The doors were locked, the windows sealed with an impossible force. It was as if the house itself was devouring me, absorbing me. When I finally managed to find an exit, the front door opened by itself, and before me, I saw a figure that shouldn't be there, my Aunt Margaret, standing in the doorway, with empty eyes and a grotesque smile plastered on her face. "You can't leave, my dear," she said, her voice echoing in the emptiness of the house. "Now you are the inheritance." Before I could react, everything went dark. And when I woke up, I didn't know if I was still alive or if I had already been consumed. When I woke up, I didn't know where I was. What haunted me the most was the silence. There were no more distant laughs, no whispered voices, or shadows dancing on the walls. But at the same time, there was something more disturbing in the air, something oppressive and definitive. The house was, in some way, emptier than before. But it wasn't a common absence. It was as if the very essence of the place had been drained, as if it was slowly disintegrating with each passing second. I tried to get up, but my movements were slow, as if I were tethered to something invisible. My legs felt heavy and my body somehow wasn't responding to my commands. I looked around, trying to orient myself. The room was small, with damp stone walls and a single light source, a lamp hanging from the ceiling, flickering intermittently. The smell of dampness and decay filled the air, as if the house itself were rotting around me. Looking closer, I noticed something even more disturbing. The walls were marked, not with dirt or normal cracks. They were deep scratches, as if something had clawed at them with ferocity. I approached one of the walls and, upon touching it, felt a chilling sensation coursing through my bones. It was a feeling that couldn't simply be described as cold. It felt as if the wall was absorbing something. I pulled my hand back quickly, and the contact left me with the sensation of being drained, as if my vitality was being sucked away by that place. With each step, the shadows seemed to stretch toward me. It was as if the space around me was constantly bending to swallow me whole. I knew, somewhere inside me, that I was no longer just trapped inside a house. I was inside the curse, ensnared in something that could not be broken. That house was not merely a physical structure. It was a living entity, fed by something far darker than the mere power of a witch. I looked at the mirror, the damned mirror. It was back. It was there, reflecting the room in a distorted manner. I knew I shouldn't look at it, but like an invisible force controlling me, my eyes were drawn to that glass as if it were an abyss. When my gaze fixed upon it, a wave of dread washed over me. I was no longer reflected there. Not exactly. Instead of my image, I saw a scene that made no sense. My body, but lifeless, unmoving, as if I were there, but in a state disconnected from reality. And behind me, a shadow began to form. It wasn't an ordinary shadow. It was a tall figure, with a presence so dense and heavy that it made the air around it compress. I saw the eyes first, empty, enormous, black as coal, and a smile that seemed to stretch endlessly, an opening in the darkness of the mirror. The figure moved slowly closer to me, but something prevented me from moving. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to, actually, because I knew that any movement could result in something far more horrific. The figure leaned in close to my ear and whispered, but the voice didn't come from outside. It came from within my mind, as if an invisible force was controlling my very voice. You think you can leave, but what you don't realize, my dear, is that you are already one of us. The inheritance, as you have discovered, is not something you can carry without paying the price. And the price, my beloved, is yourself. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. There was no more air in my lungs. The sensation was like being strangled by one's own existence. The house, the shadows, the eyes, everything was inside me now. My breathing was becoming more difficult. I felt the rising pressure, as if the house itself was slowly crushing me, piece by piece. When I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the mirror, the room around me seemed distorted, as if it were disintegrating. I was there, but at the same time, I was no longer there. I felt as if I was being sucked into the very essence of the house, into what it had become. The house was alive, and I had been consumed by it. I no longer knew where the house ended and where my own mind began. I ran to the door, but it was locked. I pounded on it hard until the knuckles of my fingers bled. But the doors wouldn't open. Somewhere behind me, a strange sound began to rise, as if something was dragging across the floor. Something heavy, something that shouldn't be there. I didn't want to look, but I was forced to. When I turned my eyes back, I saw something grotesque. It was a figure dragging itself, as if it were struggling against gravity. Its body was deformed, stretched in an unnatural way, with twisted limbs and pale, disfigured skin. Its head was tilted, eyes glowing like tiny points of light in absolute darkness. It was approaching me, with a bizarre, grotesque smile. "You're mine now," it whispered, and the sound of its voice was like the creaking of breaking bones. I screamed, finally managed to scream, but the voice wasn't mine. It was a mix of fear, pain, and an overwhelming sense of despair. And that's when I realized I was no longer alone in the house. I had never been. The walls began to pulse around me, and I realized, with absolute horror, that the marks on the walls were not just marks. They were faces, distorted and twisted faces, as if they were inside the wall, looking at me, trying to reach me, trying to pull me into them. In a last desperate effort, I tried to run for the door again. But it was in vain. I was surrounded. The house was no longer trying to trap me. It had already possessed me. And then, in a moment of total despair, I understood. The inheritance was my soul. I had been chosen, and the price was to be part of what my Aunt Margaret had become. Part of that entity. Part of that house. I tried to scream one more time, but the words never came. All I heard was the echo of laughter, that same laughter, which now seemed to come from within me. And then, the house closed in. Time, or what was left of it, began to unravel. Every movement became a struggle against something invisible and, at the same time, immeasurably powerful. What was left of my consciousness began to fragment, as if my mind was being devoured. Everything around me, every shadow, every scream, every sigh, now merged into one, an overwhelming presence that no longer wanted me to be myself. The house, that house, had made me a part of it. I no longer knew where reality ended and where the nightmare began. But there was one thing that kept me aware, the voice. The same voice I heard during that first encounter with the mirror, always behind me, at my side, inside my mind. It was my aunt's voice, or at least, something that once was her. But now it was different. It was no longer just a presence. It was a force. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" the voice said, but it was no longer human. It came from every corner, a whisper reverberating inside my head, within my bones, within my flesh. It was a blend of various voices, all overlapping and distorting. "You cannot escape me, dear. You never will." I looked into the mirror, already knowing what I would find, yet still being pulled, drawn to it as if by an abyss of need. When I saw my reflection, my body was no longer mine. I was deformed, my eyes empty and lifeless. My face covered in deep marks, as if time, or the evil itself that inhabited that house, had disfigured everything that remained of me. What I saw in the reflection was no longer a man, it was a monster, an abomination. The feeling of being consumed was unbearable. Every breath I took seemed to rip pieces from my own existence, as if my soul were being excavated. I was being disintegrated. What I had been, what I once was, no longer mattered. I was merely a memory, a mark that the house would leave behind. But then, something else manifested. Something much deeper. Something that did not belong to this world. At the back of the house, where the air was thicker and where the shadows writhed like serpents, I saw a figure. It was no longer the figure of my aunt, nor that deformed thing I had seen before. It was a greater presence, an ancestral entity. It was silent, but I knew what it was. It was the house. It was the witch. It was Blackwood. As the entity approached me, something inside me broke. The pain, the dread, the despair, all amalgamated into a silent scream. There were not enough words to describe the absolute terror I felt. It was not just death that awaited me. I had already died in some way. I had been consumed by the house, by the witch, by the legacy. I would no longer be remembered as a man. I would be just another shadow, another lost soul in a place where time does not pass, where death does not exist, but where pain is eternal. And it was in that moment that I understood. I was not being possessed by the house. I was the house now. My soul, my essence, had merged with it. The walls, the corridors, the mirror, the shadows, everything was part of me now. I was the nightmare. The figure of the witch smiled, but her smile was not one of triumph. It was a smile of solidarity. "Now you understand," she said, her voice echoing in all directions, a voice that could never be ignored again. "The inheritance never fades. It only multiplies." It was then that I realized the most terrifying of all details. The house no longer needed me. It had already consumed me, but it still wanted more. The reflection in the mirror was no longer mine. Now, it was the reflection of someone else. You, whoever is listening to this story. I, the house, the witch, we are all waiting. And you are inside the house now. The first time I heard about the house was from my brother, Vinicius. He had that peculiar look, as if he were trying to digest something he couldn't understand, which was unusual for him. Vinicius had always been rational, perhaps overly logical. When he told me about that house, he was quieter than usual, his voice hoarse, as if something had drained his energy. The house in question was located far away, on the outskirts of a small, isolated village, at the edge of a thick forest where the fog seemed to gather even during the day. No one had lived there for years, but some souls insisted on visiting it, as if something in its structure called to them. When my grandmother was still alive, she used to say that the house was cursed. However, I didn't pay much attention to the old stories until my brother, now an adult, began to show interest in it. He told me that one night, he and some friends, influenced by tales of hidden treasures or mysterious secrets, decided to explore the house. He described every detail with a rising tension in his voice. How the entrance was always locked, yet the door seemed slightly ajar, as if it had been forced. The silence, he said, was oppressive. Not even the sound of the wind in the trees could penetrate the dense atmosphere of the place. Carlos, you don't understand. The house, it wasn't empty. Vinicius's words echoed in my mind for days, but at that moment, I didn't grasp the weight of his warning. Upon entering, he and the others noticed something strange on the walls, ancient symbols, covered in dust and a thick layer of mold. But what truly froze them was the echo. The place had a bizarre acoustics, as if, even empty, there was a presence inside, watching their every move. But what disturbed my brother the most was the room. The room at the end of the hallway, with an apparently simple door, but marked with a peculiar symbol. He said that when they looked at it, they felt a wave of strange heat, as if the temperature had suddenly risen. Curiosity, of course, drove them to approach. I didn't want to go in, Carlos, he told me, as if he were speaking to himself. But something pulled me. Something wanted me to go there. And when he crossed the threshold, what he found was more terrifying than any legend that could be told. The room was empty, but shadows moved along the walls. They weren't shadows of objects, but distorted figures that seemed to watch, writhing as if trying to escape the surfaces, as if the walls themselves were a prison for something much older. That was when the echo of a low, distorted, ominous laughter began to fill the air, reverberating through the walls. They tried to leave immediately, but the door, which had been open upon their entry, was now locked, as if the very place had decided to trap them. I don't know what happened next, Vinicius whispered, still pale. But when we finally got out of there, I felt something follow me. Something I should never have seen. He looked at me, his deep eyes belonging to someone who had lived through something unspeakable, and then added, "The house is alive, Carlos. And it will come after me." I watched Vinicius as he spoke, trying to process his words. This wasn't my brother. He wasn't the same rational man I knew. Something had happened, something that had consumed his essence from the inside out. The look of fear wasn't just on his face. It was in his voice, in his body, as if the presence of whatever he had encountered hadn't left him, as if it were stuck to him, inseparable. That night, after he told me about the house, I couldn't sleep. The silence around me felt denser, more threatening, as if the very environment was waiting for something to happen. I turned over several times in bed, trying to push away the thought that maybe it would have been better never to have heard that story. But deep down, there was something in me I couldn't understand, something pulling me towards that place. A cursed curiosity, an irrational impulse that made me think, what if I went there? What if I saw with my own eyes? I didn't know why I thought that. But when the phone rang the next day, the idea was already formed in my mind. It was Vinicius. "Carlos, don't go there," he said abruptly, his voice trembling. "I can't go back anymore. You don't know what it is. You don't know what the house does to you, what it drives. It's not just the mind, it's the body too. Don't go." I tried to ask what he meant by that, but he hung up. The call was cut off abruptly, and I stood there, phone in hand, with a feeling that something was very, very wrong. It was at that moment that I decided to go. The house was about an hour's drive away. I passed through those small, abandoned villages, lifeless fields, and dense forests. The surroundings of the house seemed to suggest that time had stopped there, that there was no more space for the modern world. And as I got closer, the feeling of discomfort only grew. The sky seemed lower, the trees more imposing, and the wind seemed to scream. When I parked in front of the house, a sense of dread enveloped me like a heavy cloak. The building, though large, was in complete decay. The walls were covered in dark moss, and the dirty, broken windows seemed to stare at me like empty eyes, watching every movement. I entered without knowing exactly what I was looking for. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me. I passed through it. A shrill sound of creaking would under my feet with every step I took. The house was filled with an immense silence, the kind of silence that seemed to weigh down the air. The smell of mold and decay permeated everything, as if something had died there long ago, but death had not taken the house with it. I began to ascend the stairs, the air growing denser with each step. When I reached the upper floor, something strange happened. I no longer felt my feet touching the ground. It was as if I were floating in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The environment was disjointed, distorted, as if the walls were closing in, squeezing me from all sides. And then I saw her. The bedroom door was ajar, a dim light seeping through the cracks, as if the room itself were alive, waiting for something. I took a deep breath and entered. The smell inside the room was even worse, stronger, as if the very air were contaminated by something rotten, something that spread to every corner. I looked around, but saw nothing immediately. The furniture was covered in old, dusty sheets, and the floor, instead of wood, seemed to have transformed into something more damp, almost slimy. It was then that I heard the whisper. It was a low, hoarse voice, almost like a muffled scream, coming from the walls, from the very floor. I couldn't understand the words, but the sound seemed to invade me, tearing me apart from within. I approached the walls, my trembling hands touching what appeared to be a type of painting, or rather, a drawing marked directly on the wall. They were not just symbols, they were faces, human faces in agony, with wide eyes, mouths open in a silent scream. It seemed that those people had been absorbed by the walls, their expressions frozen in eternal suffering. Suddenly, the echo Vinicius had mentioned, the sound of the environment, changed. The shadows around me began to move. It wasn't an illusion. I could see the distorted shapes on the walls, blurred and undulating, as if the very contours of the shadows wanted to take form, wanting to escape their place. I stepped back, my body drenched in cold sweat, but then I heard a louder sound closer. Footsteps. I leapt toward the hallway, but there was no one. Just silence, an unbearable stillness that made me feel as if the house were breathing, with a rhythmic, hissing cadence. Then, the whisper grew louder. I felt a weight on my back, as if something were right behind me, watching me. The door slammed shut with a bang, trapping me there. The echo of the shadows intensified, and it was then that the walls began to bleed. The liquid was not red like blood. It was black, viscous, and spread through the cracks, as if something inside the house were finally being released. I ran, tried to open the door, but fear paralyzed me. The air seemed to thicken with each second. The sound of my heavy breaths echoed through the room, but there was no one else. When I finally managed to escape, the room was empty. But I was no longer alone. Something was following me, and I didn't know how far it would go. I ran through the house to the front door, but what I saw outside made me understand that nothing, absolutely nothing, in that place was normal. The shadows of the forest were alive, watching, and something inside me knew that, like my brother, I would never be the same. The house had fed on me, and somehow, it would never stop following me. And the worst part, I knew that, sooner or later, it would come. Again. The days following what happened in the house were the worst of my life. Deep down, I knew that what I had experienced was not normal. No logical explanation could justify what I saw, what I heard. I tried to convince myself that it was just a hallucination, a result of fear or even exhaustion. But as the days passed, something inside me began to change. It was as if I had been marked by the house. The first strange thing happened the following night. I was home alone when I started to hear a low creaking sound, an almost imperceptible noise coming from the back of the hallway. I got up from bed curious, but found nothing. The silence returned, but something in my chest felt tight, uncomfortable. The next morning, I noticed something even more disturbing. When I looked in the mirror, I saw what appeared to be a mark on my skin, just below my collarbone. It wasn't a scar or a wound. It was as if my skin had been branded by something hot, something that left a permanent impression. The mark was made up of symbols, like those I had seen on the walls of the house. But the worst part was that, as time passed, the mark seemed to grow, as if something was expanding beneath my skin. That's when reality began to distort. In the following days, my life became a nightmare. The shadows seemed to follow me wherever I went. At night, I heard echoes of low, distorted laughter, as if something were trying to call me, to lure me in. They were always closer, more real. The air in my house grew heavy, warm, as if it were being suffocated by an invisible presence I couldn't comprehend. I tried to ignore it, tried to return to normalcy, but I couldn't. I started to see things. They weren't hallucinations, they weren't shadows of my own fear. They were figures that appeared in the corner of my vision and disappeared when I tried to look directly at them. But what drove me insane was the feeling that these things knew me. They weren't strangers, they weren't alien beings. They knew who I was, and that was the most terrifying part. I remember one night, sitting on the couch, when something even more grotesque happened. The house was in absolute silence, and I was trying to calm my mind, but the sound of creaking from upstairs now seemed louder, stronger. I knew I was home alone, yet the feeling that there was another presence in the place overwhelmed me with brutal force. It was then that I heard the bedroom door open. I froze, my muscles tense, my heart racing. I slowly got up and walked to the hallway, my body filled with an indescribable dread, yet something inside me compelled me to go. When I entered the room, the temperature seemed to have dropped drastically. The air was cold, heavy, and the smell of mold and decay became almost unbearable. I knew I was no longer alone. Then I saw it. On the wall opposite the door, the shadow seemed to move, but it wasn't a normal movement. It was more as if the shadow was breathing, expanding, twisting. And with each movement, it seemed to draw closer to me, stretching in my direction. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but something paralyzed me. The sound of my own heart pounding felt deafening, as if the room had turned into a huge drum, where my life was being played at the mercy of that presence. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to get out of there. When I finally turned my back and headed toward the door, a cold hand touched my shoulder. The sensation was instant and real, as if someone were there, touching me with icy fingers, and when I looked back, there was no one. But the mark on my skin began to burn. The pain was intense, as if something were burning from the inside out. With each second, I felt my skin stretch, and a growing pressure seemed to invade my insides. There was no ignoring it anymore. I knew this wasn't normal. It wasn't something that could be explained rationally. At that moment, Vinicius's voice came back to my mind, and I couldn't help but remember. The house will come after you, Carlos. It will drag you inside. No matter what you do, it will always call you. I ran to the mirror, trying to see what was happening, and I saw it. It was no longer just a mark. Something was emerging from within me. It wasn't blood, it wasn't flesh, but it seemed like something alive. A dark, viscous substance that was oozing down my skin, as if my own flesh were transforming, grotesquely reshaping. And then the most terrifying thing happened. I saw the eyes. They were in my head. Not my eyes, but eyes. The same eyes as the faces on the walls of the house. I saw the same distorted, anguished, desperate expression. I felt them watching me, penetrating me with their oppressive presence. They were there, even though they weren't. I started to scream, desperate, but the pain on my skin clouded my thoughts. The sensation of being torn apart from within took over me, and the air was now filled with an insane whisper. It was the house. It was calling me. It was the same echo Vinicius heard. The same one he felt. I knew what would happen next. I wouldn't be able to escape. There was no way out. The house had marked me. And now, it was going to take me. I woke up the next day with a feeling of absolute emptiness. The pain on my skin had faded, but something was still there. Like an invisible weight I couldn't comprehend. The mark, that thing that started as a simple scar, now seemed to vibrate, pulsing beneath the surface of my skin. It was as if the house was inside me, as if part of my flesh now belonged to it, consumed by the same insane force that had taken it. I didn't know what to do. The house had left its mark on me, but there was still something in me that refused to believe I had been completely consumed. I looked in the mirror once more, studying my own eyes, trying to see if there was still something human left in me. That's when the phone rang. I hesitated for a second. I didn't want to answer, but something, an invisible force, pushed me forward. I picked up the receiver and put it to my ear. "Carlos?" Vinicius's voice was weak, trembling. He sounded distant, as if he was speaking from somewhere else. "Carlos, you have to listen. The house, it won't let you go." I tried. I tried to leave, but it pulled me back in. There's no way to escape. I felt my heart race, my brother's words echoing in my head. He was warning me, but what he said made me understand one thing. The house didn't want anyone to leave. It didn't want anyone to live to tell what happened there. "Vinicius, where are you?" My voice came out hoarse, filled with dread. He didn't answer. Instead, a low whisper filled the silence on the line. A voice that wasn't his, a presence I recognized immediately. It was the house. The whisper began to grow, increasing in intensity, as if it were coming from within the phone line itself. Unintelligible words, accompanied by a sharp creaking sound, a noise as if the walls were closing in around me. I could feel the air becoming denser, warmer, and the feeling of claustrophobia overwhelmed me. And then, the worst happened. The line was abruptly cut off, and the phone fell from my hand, as if something had yanked it away. I looked around, but saw no one. The environment was silent. The wind no longer passed through the cracks of the window, and even the sounds of the street had vanished. The outside world seemed to have been swallowed, as if only I and that cursed house remained. I stood up, my body trembling, and walked to the door. Something told me it wasn't safe to be there, but at the same time, an unknown force pushed me toward the exit. I needed to get out. When I opened the door, what I saw paralyzed me. The hallway was different. The walls were no longer the same. The wallpaper had warped, forming figures of agonized faces that seemed to scream in silence. The floor was covered in a viscous, dark substance that crawled as if it had a life of its own, slowly moving toward me. It was at that moment I realized the truth. The house would not let anyone leave. No matter how hard I tried. She consumed anyone who entered, and now she was pulling me into her hell. I tried to run, but my feet felt heavy, as if something was pulling me to the ground. Each step seemed harder than the last. The front door was in sight, but it never seemed to get any closer. Then I heard the sound I feared most, the echo. The same echo of footsteps, the same creak I had heard before. But this time, it wasn't just the sound of someone following me. It was as if the very past of the house was taking shape, as if the souls of all those who had entered and never left were now behind me, hungry. I was being swallowed by the space. The air closed in around me, and the darkness took form, becoming solidified, as if the very space was bending to devour me. In a last attempt to escape, I ran to the door, but before I could reach it, I saw, through the cracked mirror in the entryway, the figure I feared. It was Vinicius, but not the Vinicius I knew. He was there, but his expression was hollow, lifeless, like a puppet controlled by the house itself. His eyes were darkened, devoid of light, and his body seemed decayed, as if he was slowly dying. And then he whispered, in a voice that was not his, "You will stay with us now. There is no escape. You are part of the house, like all the others." It was then that I felt a presence envelop me, the same presence that was in every wall, in every shadow. I could no longer scream. My body was frozen, trapped in an invisible web, and the last sound I heard was the creaking of the walls, as if the house was swallowing my soul. I went inside it. And now, I am the one who waits. I am just another lost soul, a face in the walls of the house. And it will never, ever let me go. It will find you. And when it does, it will pull you inside as well. And you will be just another part of its cursed territory. Sometimes silence hides more than we can bear. Prepare to uncover what lurks in the shadows. I never believed much in ghost stories. I always thought they were just fantasies created by fertile minds, eager for a little excitement. But that was before I knew the house. Before I felt firsthand what a simple exploration could do to my sanity. It was Marcos who told us about the house. He worked as a night watchman in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and on one of those lonely nights, he overheard some old residents talking about a place, lost in some corner of the countryside, that seemed to have a life of its own. They said that no one who entered there came back whole, and Marcos, ever bold, thought it was just another one of those exaggerated old tales. So, without much thought, he invited Juliana and me to join him at the location. The house was in a small village, far from everything. To get there, we had to cross a winding road, almost invisible amidst the dense vegetation. The landscape was desolate, as if nature itself were trying to swallow what was left of the place. When we spotted the house, a strange feeling overtook me. It wasn't fear, but a restlessness, as if something was about to happen. The house stood there, frozen in time, with its dirty walls and a dense aura, hard to describe. "There's nothing to it," Marcos said, trying to sound confident, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed even him starting to doubt. Juliana, more cautious, was already wary, and it didn't take long for me to start realizing that somewhere inside me, a growing fear was also taking shape. We entered through the broken door, and as I crossed the threshold, I was met by a muffled silence. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of mold and decay. But it wasn't just the smell that bothered me. It was as if time had stopped inside. What once seemed like a simple abandoned house now felt like a place, rooted in the very earth, a structure that didn't want to be forgotten. We wandered through the rooms in search of something interesting to document. The floor creaked with each step we took, and the light from the flashlights barely illuminated what was around us. There were no furniture, just the remnants of a dark past, and now and then, we heard the distant sound of something moving, but nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something more, something we couldn't identify, a whisper in the walls, a feeling that we were being watched. Then we found the hallway. At the end, a door, which seemed more solid than the others, caught our attention. It was locked, but something about it drew us in, as if we needed to open it to understand what was really happening in that house. Marcos, as always, didn't hesitate. With the key he found in a pocket of the old clothes he wore, he unlocked the door with a sharp click. I was about to take a step back, but for some reason, I couldn't. Something was pulling me inside. The room was empty, except for a large, dark wooden table. The air there was even thicker. And it was at that moment that I realized what seemed to be an abandoned house was, in fact, something far more dangerous. On the table, there was something that made no sense. It wasn't papers or old tools, as we had imagined. It was something pulsating, like exposed flesh, connected by wires and cables that extended from the table and disappeared into the walls. The stench of rotting meat hit me like a wall, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. I looked at my friends. Marcos was there, his eyes fixed on that object. Juliana tried to take a step back, but her feet seemed glued to the floor, as if the house itself were trying to keep her there. The silence was absolute, and a feeling that something was about to happen consumed me. It was then that I looked at the center of the table and saw a brain. But it wasn't a normal brain. It was pulsating, vibrating, as if it were still alive, and with every movement, the cables connected to it seemed to stir, as if it were feeding off some energy. But the most disturbing thing of all was the hole in the center, where someone had been placed. The sense of dread took over me, and for reasons unknown, I touched that damned object. In the same instant, the entire house seemed to tremble, as if it had awoken from a nightmare. The sound was deafening, and I saw a shadow, a deformed human being trapped in that thing, its dead eyes staring at me, its hands reaching out towards me, as if they wanted to drag me into that flesh. The house shook, the walls creaked, and I had no idea what was happening. Marcos and Juliana were frozen, and I could barely breathe. In an instinctive move, I pulled Juliana back, trying to distance her from the table, but it was too late. The house would no longer let us leave. I don't remember exactly how we got out of the room. Everything became a blur of fear and terror. The only sound accompanying me was the rapid beating of my heart, echoing in my ears. When I touched the table, it felt like something inside me had been ripped out. I felt as if I were being pulled into the house, as if I were part of it now. I couldn't understand what was happening. But what I saw in that moment marked me forever. When Juliana screamed, the sound cut through the air like a sharp blade. It was a mix of terror and despair. I held her tight, trying to pull her back into the hallway, but the weight of the house seemed to keep us there, as if the walls were closing in around us. It was then that the door closed by itself. The basement door, the one we had opened, was now locked again. It couldn't be. I was sure we had left it open, but there it was, closed like a mouth ready to swallow everything. I looked back, and it was at that moment I realized that the shadows in the house were moving strangely. They were not normal shadows. They were not caused by the lantern light. They stretched, twisted, seemed to have a life of their own, as if the house itself was feeding off them. The feeling that the house was alive grew unbearable. It was as if we were inside an organism, and the heart of that house, the brain we found, was watching us. I began to feel something in the air, a constant pressure, a sense that something more was present, something that shouldn't be there. Juliana was trembling, almost speechless. Marcos, on the other hand, seemed different. His gaze was vacant, distant, as if he were in a trance. I tried to talk to him, but he didn't react, only stared at the table, at that pulsating brain, with an expression almost of adoration. An expression that sent chills down my spine. That's when he spoke in a low, hoarse whisper. "She wants us to stay." I couldn't understand what he meant. Who was she? The house? The brain? Or something else? The feeling of being watched became unbearable. I looked at the table again, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The brain was not just pulsating. It was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to notice. It seemed to be contracting and expanding, as if it were breathing. The wires and cables connected to it seemed to move on their own, as if they were alive. And at that moment, I realized the absolute horror. The house was not just alive, it was conscious. It knew we were there, and it was watching us. Marco stepped forward, as if drawn by something invisible. I shouted for him to come back, but he didn't hear me. His eyes were empty, as if he were possessed. When he got close to the table, something terrible happened. The whole house trembled, and I heard a sound, a macabre sound, as if something were dragging, something heavy, something scraping against the walls. Juliana was quietly crying, but her voice sounded muffled, as if the air were being squeezed from her lungs. I didn't know what to do. Fear had paralyzed me, and the only instinct left was the need to get out of there. But we couldn't. The floor beneath our feet distorted. It was no longer solid, no longer real. It was as if we were floating, as if the house was shaping the environment to its own will. The air became thick, almost solid, and I could no longer breathe properly. I looked at Juliana and saw her eyes widen in terror. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. Everything was being swallowed by silence, a deep silence that seemed to make the walls whisper with a voice we could not understand, but felt in every fiber of our bodies. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, a door opened. There was no reason for it to be there, but it appeared out of nowhere. A dark door, as if it were sucking in all the light around it. Inside, I saw only darkness, an emptiness that seemed to devour reality itself. I couldn't resist. Something inside me compelled me to look into that empty space. That's when I heard a voice. "Come in." It was a low whisper, as if the house was speaking directly into my mind. The voice was sweet, yet laden with something evil, something that made me tremble inside. I looked at Juliana, and she, without even realizing, began to walk towards the door. Her steps were heavy, as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. I tried to scream, to stop her, but my words wouldn't come out. Something was holding me back, preventing me from moving. Marcos was in front of me, now with his eyes fixed on the door. He started murmuring words I couldn't understand. And then he began to laugh. A low, chilling laugh that didn't sound human. "She's waiting for us," he said before taking a step toward the door. I saw his eyes lose themselves in the void, as if he were going after something. And Juliana. Juliana was entering too, like a puppet, with no control over her body. I tried to run, but in a swift motion, I felt something closing around me. The walls seemed to constrict, the hallways twisted, and an unbearable pressure filled the air. I was trapped. The house was swallowing me. What happened next? I can hardly describe. Not because I want to hide it, but because it's impossible to put into words what a human mind shouldn't comprehend. Even now, as I try to relive the events in my mind, something inside me wants to erase everything. Erase that house, that evil, that thing. But somehow, I can't forget. When the house closed around me, everything distorted. The floor was no longer the floor, the walls were no longer the walls. Everything moved, twisted, as if the house itself were alive and knew I was there, trapped, powerless. A feeling of suffocation overwhelmed me. I could no longer breathe properly, as if the air was being consumed by something invisible, something that couldn't be seen, but was there, right in front of me. I saw Marcos disappear into the darkness of the door. I didn't follow him. Something told me that if I did, I would also vanish. But Juliana, she was there, standing completely still. Her eyes, once desperate, were now empty, lifeless. It was as if she were being devoured by something inside that house. I screamed, tried to run to her, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't move. I couldn't think clearly anymore. Whatever that thing was, that house, was taking control of me, was swallowing me with every passing second. The darkness seemed to spread, oozing down the walls as if it were invading every corner of the house, and I was in the midst of it all. That's when I heard her. A voice, soft and low, coming from deep within the house, like a gentle whisper but impossible to ignore. It crawled along the walls, slipped into my ears, and lodged itself in my mind. You will stay. You will be part of it. We always need one more. The voice was feminine, yet there was something dreadful about it, as if it were being whispered directly from the house itself. I tried to scream, but my voice vanished. There was no sound left. Only the oppressive silence. And then the cables. I saw the wires connected to the brain on the table. They began to move on their own, as if they had a will of their own. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the house, as if the brain were the center of everything there, the energy, the life of that infernal structure. And suddenly, one of the walls opened up. Not a door, but a crack, as if the very wall were disintegrating to reveal an endless black corridor. Juliana, still like a puppet, walked toward that corridor. Her steps were not her own. Something was controlling her body, an invisible force, perhaps as old as the house itself. She was heading into the darkness, like an animal going to slaughter. I couldn't let her go, but at the same time, I didn't know if I could do anything. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. That's when the hole in the wall closed abruptly, as if a gigantic mouth had snapped shut around her. And again, the silence. But it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was a heavy, crushing silence. The whole house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. I looked at the spot where Juliana had been moments before. There was nothing left. She had vanished. No screams, no traces. Just the absolute silence and the sense that something far more terrible was about to come. It was at that moment that I felt it. The smell. The unbearable stench of rotting flesh, but something more, something putrid that was ingrained in the very structure of the house. It seemed to come from deep within, from the center, as if the house were feeding on something or someone, something I didn't want to understand. I knew what was happening, even though my mind was trying to convince me it wasn't real. The brain on the table began to pulse faster, with more force. Each beat seemed to extend to the walls, to my body. I could feel the vibration inside me, as if my heart had aligned with the throb of that thing. And then I saw the face. It wasn't a human face. It was a distortion, a thing I shouldn't have seen. It was as if the house had shaped a face from its own walls, from its rotting flesh. It had no eyes, but I knew it was watching me. It was the house. And I was the next victim. The thing, the face, the house, began to draw closer to me, fingers outstretched, as if it wanted to touch me. I couldn't move. I could no longer run. I was paralyzed, trapped in that place, like a fly in a spider's web. The house had found me, and I knew there was no way to escape. But it was at that moment that a memory resurfaced in my mind, a distant, almost faded memory. But now it seemed like the only thing I could do. I remembered the key that Marcos had used to open the door. The key was in my pocket. I didn't know why, but I pulled it out with trembling hands and, in a desperate gesture, ran to the hallway where the door had closed. I don't know how, but the key fit. The door opened, and I fell into darkness. I fell, as if I were falling forever, endlessly. The sound of my body crashing against the ground was muffled by the darkness. But it wasn't ordinary darkness. It was something more, something I didn't want to understand. The feeling that I was being sucked into an endless nightmare. And when I finally managed to get up and look around, I realized I was no longer alone. I didn't know where I was. The house seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The space was a distortion, a vortex of reality twisting around me, as if time itself had been torn apart. The hallway where I fell seemed endless, but still, I knew I had to walk. I had to keep going. Not out of courage, not by choice, but out of an absurd necessity, as if the house, with its overwhelming presence, was forcing me onward. I touched the walls and realized that, in doing so, something was watching me. It was a cold contact, and I didn't know if it was the house touching me or if it was me touching the house. It was a feeling of fusion, the sensation that I was part of it, part of what moved in the shadows. But then I heard it. A low sound, but increasingly louder, coming from within the house. It was the sound of something being dragged. Something very heavy. Something that shouldn't be there. When I looked at the entrance of a room that opened in front of me, I saw what was left of what was once Juliana. What remained of her, at least. Her body was there, but it was no longer what she was. Her face was distorted, as if the flesh had been stretched to the point of rupture, and her eyes. Her eyes were completely white, lifeless, yet I knew she was there. Something inside her was still alive. Her body was connected to the wall, with wires linking her pale skin to a system of cables that branched out across the room. The house seemed to be feeding her, as if she were a puppet tied to the structure. The feeling that overwhelmed me was that the brain of the house, that damned organism we had found in the basement, was responsible for this. It controlled her. It transformed her into part of itself. And it gave me the certainty that if I didn't get out of there, I would be next. Juliana tried to speak. Or rather, she tried to scream. But there was no sound left. Her mouth opened, and a jet of something viscous and black was expelled, covering the walls around. That thing was no longer human. It was no longer her. And suddenly, I understood the truth. The house didn't just consume us physically. It mentally tore us apart. It took our souls. And the brain, that damned brain, connected to all parts of the house, was doing this to all of us. I saw Marco stand. He was there, standing still, his eyes fixed on the wall, his hands outstretched as if waiting for something to touch him. But it wasn't him. It was the brain, or what was left of it, controlling his mind. He was being possessed. Every part of his being was slowly turning into yet another extension of that house, that organism. He looked at me, and in his eyes, there was no more humanity. There was emptiness. He reached out his hand to me, with an empty smile, as if inviting me to be part of it. That's when the house moved again. The pressure increased, and the walls began to contort. Everything around me seemed to be unraveling, as if collapsing into layers of corroded reality. And then I saw the true face of the house. A grotesque and deformed face emerged from the center of the room, as if it had been sculpted into the walls. It was not human. It was nothing that could be classified. It was an amalgamation of everything that was rotten, twisted, deformed. The house was alive. It breathed. It thought. And it was ready to swallow everything. Suddenly, a piercing pain shot through my chest. I looked down and saw the cables, the wires, entering me, penetrating my flesh, spreading throughout my body. I was being consumed. The house was feeding on me now. I felt every fiber of my being pulled, torn apart, and transformed. My thoughts were beginning to unravel, my vision blurring. I knew I couldn't resist. Whatever that thing was, it would consume me until I was nothing. No more than an extension of the house. That voice, that feminine voice that whispered to me at every moment, began to scream. But it wasn't one voice. It was a symphony of voices, all overlapping, distorted, like a deep echo coming from the walls. You're already here. You are part of us. There is no way out. And in the next moment, the walls closed around me. There was no escape anymore. There was nothing left but the incessant sound of the house breathing. I saw darkness take over the place, swallowing my vision, my mind. And finally, a profound silence enveloped everything. I was lost. And something told me that I would never be found again. The house possessed me. And now, I was another part of it. Have you ever wondered how far the human mind can be distorted by fear? Get ready to face the unknown, where every shadow hides an even more terrifying truth. I remember the day it all began as if it were yesterday, even though more than a year has passed. It was the day my wife passed away, a day that initially seemed like any other. Fate, with its cruel irony, caught me by surprise. She wasn't sick, she wasn't fragile. It was just an accident, something I still don't understand to this day. There was no reason for it. It just happened. And since that day, something inside me broke. Something I didn't even know existed until it shattered, leaving a deep crack and a void that's hard to describe. The void that, in some way, consumes me even now. In the first days after her death, all I did was try to understand what happened, why it happened. I knew that grief could drag me into an endless darkness, but I never imagined that the darkness would come from what I least expected. Sleep left me soon after the funeral. It wasn't a choice. It was as if my body had disconnected from something essential, a need that was ruthlessly torn from me. At first, I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend her absence. Each night, longer than the last, dragged me deeper into that bottomless pit of despair. The nights were silent, but within that stillness, something began to form, something I didn't know how to interpret. It was the first whispers that made me uncomfortable. At first, they were just distant murmurs, like the sound of the wind on a cold night. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that grief was affecting me in a way I couldn't control. However, as the weeks went by, these whispers became clearer, sharper, and began to manifest in different places around the house. The first time I heard the clear sound, I was sitting in the living room, staring into space, when a soft, almost unrecognizable voice came from somewhere behind me. "Alex," it whispered. It was her voice, my wife's, but it felt distant, like a memory that refused to fade. I turned quickly, searching for her, for any sign that she was there. But I was alone. Only the echo of the empty house responded to me. At first, I tried to ignore it, convinced that my mind was simply distorting reality. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew more persistent. I began to hear them inside the house, in the hallway, in the next room. They always called my name, always with the same softness, the same calm cadence she had when waking me in the morning. I tried to occupy my mind with anything, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They became more intense, as if my mind was bending under the pressure of loneliness. One night, I heard them coming from under the bed. That sensation, that chill that ran down my spine, was indescribable. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind, or maybe the house was starting to age. But the whisper continued clearer now, closer. I got up, my body frozen by unease, and walked to the bedroom. I don't know what led me there, but my instinct seemed to scream that something was wrong. When I crouched down to look under the bed, my vision was filled with a shadow, an indistinct figure that seemed to crawl out from the floor. It was a shapeless shadow, but with contours that somehow appeared human. I froze. Something in my chest heightened, and a chill took over the air, a cold that felt like it was coming from within me, as if death had settled there, in my own home. Then, it was when the shadow whispered my name, "Alex." And it was her voice, or what was left of it, that made me lose my reason. I recoiled, but what haunted me the most was that I couldn't move. I knew I was seeing something beyond what was possible, something that couldn't be real. But the fear I felt, the fear was not of the unknown, but of what was becoming increasingly familiar. I didn't know what to do. At that moment, something inside me broke further, a thin line that kept me anchored in reality. And what followed was a downward spiral, where time distorted, and insomnia became an endless prison. Each night, each sigh, each step in the darkness, it was as if everything was disintegrating around me, and what remained was a distant echo of a life that would never be the same. With each passing night, the weight of insomnia consumed me more. I dragged myself through the house like a zombie, no longer knowing what was real and what wasn't. Everything began to warp. I didn't know what time of day it was, whether it was morning, afternoon, or night. Everything blended into a thick fog of confusion and dread. I started to notice details I had previously ignored, things that seemed inexplicable. Like when, one morning, upon getting out of bed, I saw the hallway mirror fogged up, as if someone had breathed on it. The reflection wasn't white, as if something or someone was watching from within the glass. But there was no one there. When I approached, the glass became even foggier, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moving, just a shadow, but it seemed to twist, distort, and grow until it disappeared all at once, as if swallowed by the very surface. At first, I could still rationalize what was happening. The weight of grief, the lack of sleep, my broken mind, all of it seemed explainable. But when things started happening in the house, in the presence of people who could not see or hear what I saw, the line between reality and madness began to dissolve. That's when a friend came to visit me. His name was Marco, a co-worker I hadn't seen in some time. He was worried about me, thinking I was immersed in something much more serious than just the loss of a loved one. I tried to tell him that everything was fine, that it was just a phase, but he was determined to help me. He arrived in the late afternoon and stayed in the living room, sitting in silence, as if he knew I wasn't in a state to have a normal conversation. I had told him, between the lines, about the whispers and the shadows, but he didn't believe me. It was natural for him not to believe, as any rational person would. No one would believe. Until night fell. Marco was distracted by the television, trying to make a joke or tell some funny story to lighten the mood, but the tension in the air was palpable. Something was about to happen. I could feel it in every fiber of my body. And, as if summoned by some invisible force, the whispers began. First a soft, "Alex." I froze. Marco looked at me, as if he had heard it, but said nothing. Then the sound grew louder. "Alex, can you hear me, Alex?" I looked at Marco, trying to mask the terror that was taking over me, but he didn't seem to hear. He was turned towards the TV, laughing at something silly on the screen. I didn't know what was more frightening, the voice that was only in my ear or the fact that he seemed oblivious to everything. The voice slithered through the room, like a thread of ice touching my skin, and it seemed to draw closer. I suddenly stood up, looked towards the hallway door, and saw something that almost made me faint. The shadow I had seen before in the mirror was there, at the corner of the hallway, watching us. It was no longer just riding. Now, it seemed to take the shape of a human figure. A face distorted with empty, deep eyes. My wife's eyes. She was smiling at me, but not in a human way. It was a twisted, grim expression, as if a piece of her soul was still there, struggling to escape the abyss. "Marco!" I shouted, but he didn't react. He looked at me with a confused expression, as if I were the only one seeing the figure before us. What terrified me the most wasn't the presence of the shadow, but the feeling that something was there, with him, by his side, waiting for me to make the mistake of looking at it for too long. I backed away, trying to leave the room, but as I passed through the door, I felt a cold hand grip my wrist. It wasn't Marco's. It was a cold, rigid hand that seemed to have been dragged from beyond. It was my wife's hand. When I looked down, I saw the outline of an arm, pale, with decaying skin, the bones visible, as if it had been torn from her body. Before I could react, the shadow, with hungry eyes, lunged at me. The room plunged into total darkness. I could barely breathe. The pressure on my chest was unbearable, as if something was crushing me, sucking the life out from within. I heard Marco scream, but the sound was muffled, as if it were coming from inside a tunnel. Something was happening, something I couldn't comprehend. I tried to move, tried to escape, but my legs wouldn't respond. The weight of the malignant presence enveloping me was too much to bear. It was only when I finally fainted that the pressure eased, and darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up hours later, but not as I had expected. The house was in absolute silence, as if the world had quieted around me. But something was wrong. Marco was no longer there. His presence had vanished as if it had never existed. I tried to call him, but the phone wouldn't connect. I attempted to leave too. Run into the street, into the daylight, but when I reached the front door, I faced something impossible. The house was empty, but not like before. There were no more furniture, no walls, no ceiling. All that remained was a thick fog, with a smell of decay that made me want to vomit. It was as if the house had been consumed by something, by an invisible force that stripped me of everything I knew. The only thing left was the sound of my own footsteps echoing in what was somehow still my reality. But there was something else. Something was watching me. Something moved behind the fog. Something that knew my name. I no longer knew where I was. The fog was thick, dense, like a viscous substance that clung to my skin and lungs, making it hard to breathe. I tried to walk, but my feet felt like they were sinking into something sticky, as if the ground was slowly absorbing my body, pulling me down. Each step I took was a titanic effort, and as I looked at what remained of my house, I realized something I hadn't noticed until that moment. It was no longer in the same place. It was no longer in the same world. The house was no longer my house. I forced myself to shift my gaze to the emptiness around me. The place where walls once stood now appeared to be a vast cavern of broken and cracked concrete. The ceiling was collapsing, but not in a natural way. There were no fallen tiles or remnants of rotting wood. What remained seemed to have been corroded, as if a supernatural force had worn everything down to just the skeleton of the structure, like a carcass of something that had died long ago. I tried to go back to the door, but it was different. There was no longer a doorknob, nor the light from outside. Just a wall of darkness, a dense and oppressive darkness that swallowed me as soon as I approached. I couldn't see anything through it, but I could feel the presence of something that was watching me. The air was heavy, filled with a putrid and sweet smell, as if something was rotting right in front of me. A scent that came from nothing natural, but from something that shouldn't exist. My mind was shattering, the threads of my sanity disintegrating with each passing second. I looked at the corners and felt a presence. Whispers enveloped me, but they didn't come from my head. They were real, concrete, coming from somewhere beyond, from a darker, deeper corner. "Alex, don't you understand yet?" My wife's voice sounded again, more distorted, more seductive, yet at the same time more merciless. I felt as if I was being dragged into an abyss, where no rules existed anymore. Where the voices I heard weren't mine, but from something that was feeding on my pain, my confusion. I closed my eyes, tried to block everything out, but when I opened them again, something had changed. What was an empty, deteriorating house was now different. There were furniture pieces, but they were distorted, deformed, as if made of flesh and bone instead of wood and upholstery. The chairs seemed to have arms that twisted, the sofas were covered in human skin, and the smell of decomposition intensified with each second. It was when I looked at what remained of the living room that something definitely broke inside me. Marco's body was there, sprawled on the floor, but he wasn't dead. His body was twisted, as if it had been contorted, the face contorted in a scream that couldn't be heard. He lay there, but his eyes were open, staring at me. His eyes were now completely white, without pupils, and his hands were outstretched toward me, as if wanting to touch me, pull me closer. I spun on my heels, and when I tried to run, the walls began to close in, as if the house wanted to swallow me, consume me entirely. I didn't know where to go, and the more I tried to escape, the closer the shadows came. I could feel the whispers, now accompanied by a low, insane laugh that seemed to come from all sides. The voices were clearer, closer, and something told me they knew what I had done, what I was about to do. The weight of guilt, of fear, all mixed in my mind, creating a knot so tight that I could barely breathe. I knew the house wasn't real, that none of this could be happening. But the pain I felt, the reality surrounding me, all of it was becoming more tangible with each second. I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was an illusion. The house, Marco's figure, my wife's shadow, all seemed to merge into a single, terrible truth. I was trapped there, in a cycle of suffering and regret that would never end. So, in a moment of absolute despair, I screamed. I screamed for her, for my wife, for everything I had lost, and for everything that was now lost forever. When the voice finally left my throat, it did not echo. It was absorbed by the darkness. And in that moment, I knew that something inside me had broken irreversibly. The feeling of being watched never ceased to exist, but now, something else was present. The shadow was behind me. I did not look back, not because I was afraid of seeing what was there, but because I already knew what I would find. I could feel the presence drawing closer, as if the very shadows of the house were stretching out to embrace me. I was being pulled, absorbed, as if the ground, the air, the house itself wanted to swallow me. And in that moment, the darkness consumed me completely. I woke up hours later, but the feeling of being outside reality never left me. I found myself in my own room, but something was different. I was no longer alone. My wife was there, beside me, silently. She was not the same figure as before. It was her, but with dead, lifeless eyes. And worst of all, she was no longer smiling. She simply watched me, as if she knew something I did not. Something I would never understand. I no longer knew if I was alive or dead. If I was dreaming or trapped somewhere that should not exist. But one thing was certain, each night she would return. I knew that. I knew that with each night, something darker, heavier would come. Each night, I would feel that weight on my chest, and the darkness would once again take me. And when the night comes, she will whisper my name. I know there is no way to escape anymore. I know that nothing is real anymore. I knew something was wrong. It was no longer the weight of guilt, nor the presence of shadows that haunted me. There was something darker, something I had not considered. Each passing night brought me closer to the truth, while simultaneously pulling me away from my own sanity. When I woke up the next morning, I felt an excruciating pain in my chest. Not a physical pain, but a sense of emptiness, as if the very air around me was disintegrating. But when I opened my eyes, I realized my wife was no longer beside me. There was no one else. The house was silent, but the silence had never been so deafening. I struggled to get up, my legs shaky as if they had been broken and put back together haphazardly. I looked into a hallway mirror, expecting to see my reflection, but what I saw was only emptiness. The mirror was fogged, as if something was trying to hide within it. As if the reflection had distorted, pulled away from me. But when I looked closer, something moved. It was not a shadow, nor my own reflection, but a figure that slinked out of the mirror, a dark, twisted silhouette. I was paralyzed, breathless, and it was then that I heard her. My wife's voice, no longer soft, but deep, guttural. She was no longer whispering my name. She screamed, as if she was struggling to escape from somewhere, a place without light, without life. "Don't you understand yet, Alex?" I wanted to learn, but I couldn't. My feet were planted on the ground, my hands sweaty, trembling. The figure in the mirror smiled, and that smile was the last thing I saw. It wasn't a smile of pain, but of triumph. And when its eyes met mine, I knew what had happened. The house, the mirror, the whispers, her presence, it all made sense now. My wife wasn't dead. She had never died. I had never left that place. I was trapped there, inside the mirror, inside the house. All of it was an illusion, a construct of my own mind, but her presence, she had taken me. She had dragged me into this distorted reality, where she ruled, where she fed on my fears, my regrets. I had been the next sacrifice, the last piece of a macabre game. I tried to scream, but my throat was closed, as if something were suffocating me. The house was alive, breathing, and I was trapped in it. I looked at the shadows around me, and saw the eyes of others like me. People, or what was left of them. Their expressions were empty, their bodies deformed, their faces twisted in eternal pain, as if they had been turned into part of the house. They had been consumed, taken by the darkness. And I knew, with a terrifying clarity, that soon I would be another one. I would become one of the shadows. A forgotten figure. Trapped forever in this hellish place. And then I heard the sound that had tormented me before. The whisper. But it wasn't my wife. It was something deeper, more horrifying. Something that should never have been. The voice calling me was not human. It resonated deep in my mind, as if an entire crowd were whispering my name. "You will stay with her forever." And it was at that moment, when the truth finally crushed me, that the house made its final move. The ground beneath me opened up, swallowing me with a force I could not resist. The darkness enveloped me like a layer of plastic, muffling my screams. and when my eyes closed for the last time, I saw my wife one last time, but not as before. Now, she had no form, she had no face. She was just a shadow, a distorted figure smiling in a monstrous way, waiting for me. I was swallowed, not by death, but by the eternal repetition of my own torture. There was no more hope. There was no more escape. I am part of this house now, part of this curse. And all that remains for me is to wait for you to come too. Because in the end, we all stay here. All of us forever. And before the darkness consumes me again, I hear the last thing I have left, the sound of the last breath, and the names of all those who came before me. I always knew something was wrong there. Maybe it was the hospital's gloomy environment, or the cold walls, covered in a yellowish paint that seemed to absorb the light. That place had a heavy energy, as if the souls of the patients who passed through had not found peace. But what troubled me, what made me wake up in panic every night, was not just the place. It was the veil. I had been there since the accident. The doctor said I suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, that what I saw was an illusion, a reflection of my troubled mind. They told me that the screams and whispers in the walls were just echoes of my past. But I knew it wasn't that. I knew what I saw, what I lived, was real. It all began that night. I was in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the murmurs of other patients who were, like me, in the rehabilitation wing. The room was calm, the only light coming from a weak lamp in the corner, and the air was thick, stifling. My roommate, Elisa, was sleeping deeply, or so it seemed. She had always been quiet, silent, with an almost celestial presence, but I considered her good company. Then I saw it. It wasn't a sound, nor a noise, but something in the environment changed. Like a sudden drop in temperature. I saw the veil. It appeared slowly, a black shroud, floating as if it had a life of its own. There was no wind, no explanation for it. The fabric seemed to stretch, undulating in the air like a thick fog, covering the walls, the floor, and finally engulfing Elisa's bed. I tried to scream, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. The veil was taking shape, taking over everything. Elisa stirred in her bed but did not wake up. It was then that I felt it. Something pulling her into the veil. I saw the hand, cold and skeletal, dragging her into the darkness. I screamed finally, but no sound came out. She vanished, without a single trace, as if she had never been there. I quickly got up, trying to turn on the light, but the lamp no longer worked. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to look. But when I looked back at the corner of the room, I saw something moving. Something not human. It was a shadow, a distorted figure, as if trying to materialize from the veil itself. But with every movement it made, the creature disintegrated, as if the veil was a barrier separating it from the real world. I went to the door, banging with all my strength, trying to call for someone, but the ward was empty. No one responded. I went to the window, hoping to see something outside, someone who could hear me, but the darkness was absolute. The silence was overwhelming. When I returned to my place, the veil had disappeared. Elisa's bed was empty, but the room was intact. No marks, no evidence that anything had happened. I was alone with the emptiness and fear. The next morning, I was told that Elisa was absent and that I had dreamed it all. They said I was getting nervous, that it was just stress. But I knew what I saw. I knew what happened. The worst, however, was yet to come. During the following weeks, something strange occurred. I was not alone in the room. Even if I was, the veil was still there. Sometimes I felt its presence near me, like a weight in the air. I heard whispers, low and indistinguishable murmurs, as if something was trying to speak to me through the black mist. And every night, when silence took over the hospital, I felt the eyes of something watching me. I knew the creature was still there, watching, waiting for the right moment to take me too. But what no one knew, what no one would believe, was that the veil was not just an entity. It was a portal, and every soul that disappeared through it never returned. I don't know how much time I have left before the veil comes again. I just know that with each passing night, I feel closer to being consumed by it. And if I disappear, no one will believe what I'm telling now. They say I'm sick, that all of this is just a product of my disturbed mind. But I know what I saw. And the veil, it will never leave me in peace. I am next. That night, I knew something was about to happen. It wasn't a vague or uncertain feeling. It was a visceral certainty, something instinctive, like a portent that made the air feel denser and colder. The veil was approaching, and I could feel its presence unbearably, like a pressure in my lungs. I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a product of my mind. Every corner of the hospital seemed immersed in a deeper darkness, a darkness that was not just the absence of light, but the absence of any hope. I was lying in my bed, but I couldn't close my eyes. The sound of respirators and heart monitors echoed down the hallway, creating a grim music that blended with my growing fear. I went to the window, hoping that the simple act of looking at the outside world would bring me some sense of normalcy. But all I saw was a thick fog, covering the city and swallowing the outlines of houses and trees. It was as if the world had been erased, as if the mist was taking over everything. I turned, unable to resist the urge to look at the corner where the veil manifested. And there it was, stronger than before. It was no longer just a simple mist, but a viscous and opaque substance, stretching, writhing, and taking shape, as if it were gaining consistency. I knew what was about to happen. I knew that at any moment something, or someone, would be pulled into it, like Elisa. But before I could move a muscle, I heard a whisper. Low, nearly imperceptible, but as clear as the sound of a blade cutting through skin. It came from within the veil. I see you. The phrase dragged itself into my ears as if someone were whispering directly into my mind. I froze. It wasn't the sound of the voice that scared me. It was its touch, cold, icy, like a blade of ice piercing my spine. I knew it wasn't my imagination. I knew it was happening right then, in that moment. I stood up, instinctively trying to leave the room. But as I took the first step, a searing pain shot through my head, as if something were trying to tear at my consciousness. I screamed, but I could no longer form words. The veil was no longer just a presence, but a force that seemed to have a will of its own, as if it were feeding off my fear. When I looked at the bed, something made me stop. Elisa. She was there, but not her. Elisa's body lay on the bed, but her eyes were open. What remained of her skin was pale, almost gray, and her lips were stretched in an expression of horror, as if she was still alive, but trapped somewhere between the world of the living and the dead. And then the hands. Elisa's hands were stretched forward, as if she wanted to reach me, but couldn't. She was there, but she wasn't. And as much as my mind screamed to flee, something compelled me to go closer, to look more closely, even knowing it wasn't safe. Like an insane desire, like an invisible force pulling me into that abyss. I approached and touched her. My hand would have trembled if it weren't paralyzed by fear. When I touched her cold skin, I felt something more. It wasn't just the absence of warmth. It was as if I were touching something that didn't belong to the world of the living, something distorted, twisted, as if Elisa's very essence had been consumed, replaced by something grotesque. Then her eyes moved. Slowly. But not in a natural way. It was as if the eyelids were opening against their will, as if the flesh were being pulled by invisible threads. And the gaze, that gaze. It wasn't Elisa's gaze. It was something looking through her, something that shouldn't exist. And that gaze fixed on me, freezing me to the bone. I immediately pulled my hand away, and when I looked again, Elisa's body was gone. There was no trace of her on the bed. Nothing. Just the empty mattress, the crumpled sheet, and a single drop of blood. It wasn't much, just a small stain, but it was not normal. It seemed to be slowly expanding, as if it were seeping into the wood of the floor, crawling into the boards, as if the very environment were being contaminated. That's when the door to the room opened. I nearly fainted from fear, but when I looked at the figure in the doorway, I saw a man. A nurse, I thought, but soon realized something was wrong. He didn't move like a normal person. His steps were heavy, awkward, as if he were dragging his feet. And his eyes were completely empty, as if there were no more life left there. There was no sparkle, no feeling. Just an empty expression, devoid of awareness. You saw her, didn't you? The nurse's voice was weak, like a distant whisper, and his body seemed unsteady, as if it were about to collapse. But the way he spoke, the way he looked at me made me believe he knew exactly what was happening. I didn't know what to respond. I had no idea what he wanted from me. But before I could open my mouth, he stepped forward, and the icy feeling in the room intensified. I knew the veil was there close to us, and I knew he had already chosen his next victim. And upon hearing the whisper again, I finally understood. He was behind us. The veil made no distinctions. It took the soul of whoever was closest, whoever was weakest. And I knew I could be next. The nurse finally opened his mouth, but his words made no sense. He said something about not being able to return, about losing control, but his voice was no longer human. It was a grotesque mix of murmurs and laments. I ran down the hallway, desperate, but the hospital was now a labyrinth. The walls were closing in, the floor felt like it was giving way beneath my feet, and the air was unbearably thick. I was being followed. I felt the veil, felt the creature approaching. But worst of all, I felt there was no way out. Something was waiting for me outside. Something that wasn't human. Something that wasn't of this world. I didn't know where I was going. The hospital seemed to be stretching and contracting, the corridors twisting, as if the walls were molding to my fear. Each step I took felt heavier, more difficult. The sound of my feet echoed off the empty walls, but there was no one else there. No nurse, no doctor, no patient. Just me. And the feeling of being watched. The feeling that with every move, I was getting closer to something, not human. I didn't want to look back, but something was pulling me. It wasn't curiosity. It was fear. A deep, primal fear that compelled me to turn, even knowing I shouldn't. When I did, I saw the shadow. It was no longer a mist. It was no longer a floating veil. Now it had form, a grotesque shape that slithered down the corridor, mirroring each of my movements. It was as if darkness itself had come to life. It writhed, distorted, taking on the contours of something undefined, like a creature made of shadows and rotting flesh. But what terrified me most was the sound it made. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. No. It was the sound of something being dragged slowly, as if the bones of a person were breaking, as if a dead body were being forced to move. I stepped back, trying to run, but my legs wouldn't respond as they should. I was paralyzed, as if the environment itself had closed in on me, as if I were being swallowed by darkness. Every corridor stretched out before me, but there was no exit, no window, no door. Just more corridors, more walls closing in. I was lost. Lost inside the hospital. Lost within my own mind. I heard a laugh. Not a human laugh. It was something distorted, as if someone had broken their own voice, turning it into something monstrous. It came from within me, from some deep place I didn't want to go. I tried to scream, but the sound came out as a whisper, almost imperceptible. The laughter continued, repeating, escalating, and I knew what was happening. I knew the veil was consuming me, pulling me into itself, erasing me, turning me into yet another lost soul, doomed to wander forever in the void. When I finally managed to move, I took a step back, stumbling into the shadows that seemed to grow around me. That's when I saw it. A door. An old, dark wooden door that stood like a portal to the unknown. I knew I should avoid it, that I shouldn't approach. But I had no choice. Something inside me propelled me toward it, as if the door were the only hope of escaping the creature dragging behind me. I opened the door, and what I found, that I cannot describe. Not with words. It was a room, but not an ordinary room. It was a place where time did not exist. The air was heavy, permeated with the smell of mold and decay. The floor was covered in something viscous, as if the very environment were suppressed. As if it were absorbing evil. The walls were marked, like scratches, as if something had tried to escape them, as if they were screaming for help. But what made me stop was the sound. It was a whisper, but not a human whisper. It was more like a lament. A lament that made me feel as if all my wrong choices had led me there. As if the room were the embodiment of my own guilt. I didn't know what was happening, but the smell, the sound, the feeling of being watched, all of it made me realize that I shouldn't be there. And then, in the corner of the room, something moved. I saw a shadow. Not the same shadow that had been following me. This one was different. It was denser, more solid. It was like a human figure, but the form was distorted, as if being squeezed by an invisible force, as if it were trying to materialize but couldn't. Her eyes were two empty holes, black as night, and when she looked at me, I felt my soul being torn apart. I could no longer think. I could no longer breathe. The creature approached slowly, its steps dragging along the floor as if each movement was a torture for it. But I knew it wasn't a torture for her. It was a torture for me. I was being pulled into her darkness, as if I were being sucked into a vortex of despair. I tried to escape, but the walls of the room closed in around me. The door was behind me, but it was no longer there. I was trapped, at the center of absolute terror. And that's when I understood. The veil was not an entity. It was not a creature or a spirit. The veil was the hospital. It was the hospital itself, a manifestation of all the lost souls that had been consumed by it over the years. A web of suffering, fear, and death that fed on every person who crossed those doors. The veil was the asylum of the soul, and once you entered, there was no way out. I saw something more. Something that still haunts me. In the corners of the room, shadows moved, twisted, human shapes that were trapped, frozen in darkness, waiting to be consumed by it. I saw the faces, the expressions of despair. They were there, but they were not alive. Not anymore. They were waiting to be pulled into the veil. And I was next. When I finally managed to scream, the sound that came from my mouth was no longer mine. It was a scream of all the souls, all the victims who had fallen before me, crying out in unison, like an echo lost in the darkness. But no one heard. And I am still here, trapped in the veil, trapped in the memory of what I saw. Perhaps you are too. Perhaps you have already been chosen. I know you are wondering if everything I said is real. If this story is not just a product of my disturbed mind. I know, because the doubt is the same that torments my soul every day. But the truth you won't want to accept, is that the line between the real and the unreal disappears when the veil stretches over you. And I am the proof that it spares no one. I knew I was losing my sanity. I knew the voices in the walls were not just echoes of the past, but a warning that I was being consumed. But what I didn't know, what no one could ever imagine, is that the true face of the veil was not the dark mist stretching through the hospital, nor the distorted shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. No. The veil, the true nature of the veil, was something much darker and more perverse. I was alone in the room where it all began. The door to the room was now locked, but there were no more hallways in front of me, no more walls, no ceiling. I was in absolute emptiness. The air was thick, as if I were breathing a dense substance, an invisible poison that seeped into my veins, making me part of that place, part of that prison. And then I heard it. The sound that chased me, the sound that echoed through all my cells. It was a whisper. Not like the others, but different. It didn't come from outside. It came from within me. From somewhere I could no longer distinguish what was me and what the veil had become. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was trapped in the silence of a scream that would never be heard. "You are the last," the whisper said. "You are the last one remaining." The words made no sense, but I knew. I knew what they meant. I was the last survivor, the last one not completely consumed by the veil. I knew that from that moment on, my soul would also be lost. Because the veil doesn't just swallow bodies. It swallows souls. It devours them, and all that's left is an echo of what you were. And that echo never stops screaming, never stops remembering what was lost. I looked at the corners of the room, and then the shadows began to move. But they were no longer shadows. They were taking shape, each one gaining a human outline, a face. I saw the faces of all who had been swallowed before me. The faces of Elisa, the nurse, the other souls trapped there, condemned to wander in eternal emptiness. And what terrified me most was seeing that they were looking at me. Not with fear, but with resignation, with the certainty that I had already been consumed, that there was no way out. I tried to close my eyes, I tried to escape, but there was nothing more to be done. The veil was inside me, no longer around me. It was making me part of it, dragging me to a place where there would be no more memories, where there would be no more screams. Just silence and darkness. But that was when I saw something even more terrible. Something that made me understand that perhaps I was already dead. A figure. A figure rising from the shadows, shaping itself from the darkness itself. It was not human. It was not an entity I could comprehend. It was something that should not exist. And not being that thing, had the same eyes I saw in Elisa, in the nurse, in all the others. Empty, black, deep eyes, as if nothing else could be seen beyond the abyss. As if they had already been consumed, but were destined to watch the fall of all the others. You saw, the creature whispered, its voice an amalgamation of all the screams, all the lost souls that had been swallowed by the veil. Now you are part of us. I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was hallucination. The hospital, the city, the corridors, all of it seemed increasingly distant. All I saw now were the eyes of the lost souls, looking at me with an insatiable hunger. And before I could scream, before I could even move, I felt the veil wrap around me, pulling me inside itself. It was the end. Not just the end of my life, but the end of everything I knew. The veil was not a mere phenomenon. It was a curse. A curse that spreads and consumes. It doesn't just erase life. It erases existence itself. It swallows what you were, where you could have been, and in the end, it turns you into part of the void. And that's how everything ended. There was no more light. No more sound. No more anything. When you hear this story, when the shadows around you begin to move, you will remember. You will remember me. And you will finally understand that the veil is closer than you think. It's not just in hospitals. It's anywhere souls get lost. And once it sees you, you never escape. Because the veil swallows everything. Did you like this story? Then don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. You can also send your story to our email in the description. Who knows, maybe your story will appear here. See you next time, if you're still here.